Bantam Audio Publishing presents Never Cry Wolf. This is Farley Mowat. It is a long way in time and space from the bathroom of my grandmother Mowat's house in Oakville, Ontario, to the bottom of a wolf den in the barren lands of central Keewatin, and I have no intention of retracing the entire road which lies between. Nevertheless, there must be a beginning to any tale, and the story of my sojourn amongst the wolves begins properly in Granny's bathroom. When I was 5 years old, I had still not given any indication, as most gifted children do well before that age, of where my future lay. Perhaps because they were disappointed by my failure to declare myself, my parents took me to Oakville and abandoned me to the care of my grandparents while they went off on a holiday. The Oakville house, Green Hedges it was called, was a singularly genteel establishment, and I did not feel at home there. Grandmother, an aristocratic lady of Welsh descent who had never forgiven her husband for having been a retail hardware merchant, tolerated me, but terrified me too. She terrified most people, including grandfather, who had long since sought surcease in assumed deafness. He used to while away the days as calm and unruffled as Buddha, ensconced in a great leather chair, and apparently oblivious to the storms which swirled through the corridors of Green Hedges. And yet, I know for a fact that he could hear the word whiskey if it was whispered in a room 3 stories removed from where he sat. Because there were no soulmates for me at Green Hedges, I took to roaming about by myself, resolutely eschewing the expenditure of energy on anything even remotely useful, and thereby, if anyone had had the sense to see it, giving a perfectly clear indication of the pattern of my future. One hot summer day, I was meandering aimlessly beside a little local creek when I came upon a stagnant pool. In the bottom, and only just covered with green scum, 3 catfish lay gasping out their lives. They interested me. I dragged them up on the bank with a stick and waited expectantly for them to die, but this they refused to do. Just when I was convinced that they were quite dead, they would open their broad, ugly jaws and give another gasp. I was so impressed by their stubborn refusal to accept their fate that I found a tin can, put them in it along with some scum, and took them home. I had begun to like them, in an abstract sort of way, and wished to know them better. But the problem of where to keep them while our acquaintanceship ripened was a major one. There were no washtubs in Green Hedges. There was a bathtub, but the stopper did not fit, and consequently it wouldn't hold water for more than a few minutes. By bedtime, I'd still not resolved the problem, and since I felt that even these doughty fish could hardly survive an entire night in the tin can, I was driven to the admittedly desperate expedient of finding temporary lodgings for them in the bowl of Granny's old-fashioned toilet. I was too young at the time to appreciate the special problems which old age brings in its train. It was one of these problems which was directly responsible for the dramatic and unexpected encounter which took place between my grandmother and the catfish during the small hours of the ensuing night. It was a traumatic experience for Granny, and for me, and probably for the catfish too. Throughout the rest of her life, Granny refused to eat fish of any kind, and always carried a high-powered flashlight with her during her nocturnal peregrinations. I cannot be as certain about the effect on the catfish, for my grandfather, once the hoofera had died down a little, flushed the toilet. As for myself, the effect was to engender in me a lasting affinity for the lesser beasts of the animal kingdom. In a word, the affair of the catfish marked the beginning of my career, first as a naturalist and later as a biologist. I had started on my way to the wolf den. My early years as a naturalist were free and fascinating, but as I entered manhood and found that my avocation must now become my vocation, the walls began to close in. The happy days of the universal scholar, who was able to take a keen interest in all phases of natural history, were at an end, and I was forced to recognize the unpalatable necessity of specializing if I was to succeed as a professional biologist. Nevertheless, as I began my academic training at the university, I found it difficult to choose the narrow path. My personal predilections lay toward studies of living animals in their own habitat. Being a literal fellow, I took the word biology, which means the study of life, at its face value. I was sorely puzzled by the paradox that many of my contemporaries tended to shy as far away from living things as they could get, and chose to restrict themselves instead to the aseptic atmosphere of laboratories, where they used dead, often very dead, animal material as their subject matter. In fact, during my time at the university, it was becoming unfashionable to have anything to do with animals, even dead ones. The new biologists were concentrating on statistical and analytical research, whereby the raw material of life becomes no more than fodder for the nourishment of calculating machines. My inability to adjust to the new trends had an adverse effect upon my professional expectations. While my fellow students were already establishing themselves in various esoteric specialties, most of which they invented for themselves, on the theory that if you are the only specialist in a given field, you need fear no competition, I was still unable to deflect my interest from the general to the particular. As graduation approached, I found that the majority of my contemporaries were assured of excellent research jobs, while I seemed to have nothing particular to offer in the biological marketplace. It was, therefore, inevitable that I should end up working for the government. The die was cast one winter's day when I received a summons from the Federal Wildlife Service informing me that I had been hired at the munificent salary of $120 a month and that I would report to Ottawa at once. I obeyed this peremptory order with hardly more than a twitch of subdued rebelliousness, for if I had learned anything during my years at the university, it was that the scientific hierarchy requires a high standard of obedience, if not subservience, from its acolytes. 2 days later, I arrived in the windswept, gray-souled capital of Canada and found my way into the dingy labyrinth which housed the Wildlife Service. Here I presented myself to the chief mammologist, whom I had known as a school chum in more carefree days. But, alas, he had now metamorphized into a full-blown scientist and was so shrouded in professional dignity that it was all I could do to refrain from making him a profound bow. Through the next several days, I was subjected to something called orientation, a process which, so far as I could see, was designed to reduce me to a malleable state of hopeless depression. At any rate, the legions of Dante-esque bureaucrats whom I visited in their gloomy, formalin-smelling dens where they spent interminable hours compiling dreary data or originating meaningless memos did nothing to rouse in me much devotion to my new employment. The only thing I actually learned during this period was that, by comparison with the bureaucratic hierarchy in Ottawa, the scientific hierarchy was a brotherhood of anarchy. Levity was not looked upon with favor anywhere in those austere offices, as I discovered for myself while attending a conference concerning my first assignment. A tentative list of the material requirements for this assignment lay on the conference table, surrounded by many grave countenances. It was a formidable document made out in quintuplicate, as was the official rule, and imposingly headed, "Desiderata for the Lupine Project." Having already been unnerved by the gravity of the gathering, I lost my head completely when the assembly began to consider the 12th item listed in this horrendous document. Paper, toilet, government issue, 12 rolls. An austere suggestion by the representative of the finance department that, in the interests of economy, the quantity of this item might be reduced, providing the field party, which was me, exercised all due restraint, sent me into an hysterical spasm of giggling. I mastered myself almost instantly, but it was too late. The two most senior men, both majors, rose to their feet, bowed coldly, and left the room without a word. The Ottawa ordeal drew toward its end, but the climax was still to come. One early spring morning, I was called to the office of my direct chief for a final interview before departing into the field. My chief sat behind a massive desk whose dusty surface was littered with yellowing groundhog skulls. He had been studying rates of tooth decay in groundhogs ever since he joined the department in 1897. At his back hung the frowning, bearded portrait of an extinct mammologist who glared balefully down upon me. The smell of formalin swirled about like the fetid breath of an undertaker's back parlor. After a long silence, during which he toyed portentously with some of his skulls, my chief began his briefing. There was a solemnity about the occasion which would have done justice to the briefing of a special agent about to be entrusted with the assassination of a head of state. As you are aware, Lieutenant Mowat, my chief began, "the Canis lupus problem has become one of national importance. Within this past year alone, this department has received no less than 37 memoranda from members of the House of Commons, all expressing the deep concern of their constituents that we ought to do something about the wolf. Most of the complaints have come from such civic-minded and disinterested groups as various fish and game clubs, while members of the business community, in particular the manufacturers of well-known brands of ammunition, have lent their weight to the support of these legitimate grievances of the voting public of this great dominion, because their grievance is the complaint that the wolves are killing all the deer, and more of our fellow citizens are coming back from more and more hunts with less and less deer. As you may possibly have heard, my predecessor supplied the minister with an explanation of this situation, in which it was his contention that there were fewer deer because the hunters had increased to the point where they outnumbered the deer, about 5 to 1. The minister, in all good faith, read this fallacious statement in the House of Commons and was promptly shouted down by members howling, "Liar" and "Wolf lover." 3 days later, my predecessor retired to civilian life, and the minister issued a press statement. "The Department of Mines and Resources is determined to do everything in its power to curb the carnage being wreaked upon the deer population by hordes of wolves. A full-scale investigation of this vital problem, employing the full resources of the department, is to be launched at once. The people of this country can rest assured that the government, of which I have the honor to be a member, will leave no stone unturned to put an end to this intolerable situation." At this juncture, my chief seized a particularly robust groundhog skull and began rhythmically clacking its jaws together as if to emphasize his final words. "You, Lieutenant Mowat, have been chosen for this great task. It only remains for you to go out into the field at once and tackle this work in a manner worthy of the great traditions of this department. The wolf, Lieutenant Mowat, is now your problem." Somehow I staggered to my feet and with an involuntary motion brought my right hand up in a smart salute before fleeing from the room. I fled from Ottawa, too, that self-same night, aboard a Canadian Air Force transport plane. My immediate destination was Churchill on the western shore of Hudson Bay. But beyond that, somewhere in the desolate wastes of the subarctic Barrens, lay my ultimate objective, the wolf himself. The Air Force transport was a twin-engine plane capable of carrying 30 passengers, but by the time all my desiderata were aboard, there was barely room left for the crew and me. The pilot, an amiable flight lieutenant wearing a handlebar mustache, watched the load going aboard with honest bewilderment writ large across his brow. His only information about me was that I was some sort of government man going on a special mission to the Arctic. His expression grew increasingly quizzical as we swung 3 great bundles of clanking wolf traps into the cabin, following these with the midsection of a collapsible canoe, which looked like nothing so much as a bathtub without ends. True to departmental precedent, the bow and stern sections of this canoe had already been shipped to another biologist who was studying rattlesnakes in the South Saskatchewan desert. My armament was loaded aboard next. It consisted of 2 rifles, a revolver complete with holster and cartridge belt, 2 shotguns, and a case of tear gas grenades, with which I was expected to persuade reluctant wolves to leave their dens so they could be shot. There were also 2 large smoke generators, prominently labeled "Danger," to be used for signaling to aircraft in case I got lost, or perhaps in case the wolves closed in. A case of wolf getters, fiendish devices which fire a charge of potassium cyanide into the mouth of any animal which investigates them, completed my arsenal. My scientific gear followed, including 2 5-gallon cans, at the sight of which the pilot's eyebrows shot right up under his cap. They were marked 100% grain alcohol for the preservation of specimen stomachs. Tents, camp stoves, sleeping bags, and a bundle of 7 axes. To this day, I don't know why 7, for I was going to a treeless land where even 1 would have been superfluous. Skis, snowshoes, dog harness, a radio transceiver, and innumerable boxes and bales whose contents were as inscrutable to me as to the pilot, all followed in due course. When everything was in and securely roped down, The pilot, co-pilot, and I crawled over the massive gear and wedged ourselves into the cockpit. The pilot, having been thoroughly trained in the demands of military security, mastered his rampant curiosity as to the nature and purpose of my bizarre outfit, and contented himself with the gloomy comment that he doubted if the old crate could get airborne with all that lot aboard. Secretly, I doubted it too. But although the plane rattled and groaned dismally, she managed to take off. The flight north was long and uneventful, except that we lost one engine over James Bay and had to complete the journey at an altitude of 500 feet through rather dense fog. This minor contretemps temporarily took the pilot's mind off the problem of who and what I was. But once we had landed in Churchill, he was unable to contain his curiosity any longer. "I know it's none of my damn business," he began apologetically as we walked toward one of the hangars. "But for heaven's sakes, chum, what's up?" "Oh," I replied cheerfully, "I'm going off to spend a year or two living with a bunch of wolves, that's all." The pilot grimaced as if he was a small boy who had been justly rebuked for an impertinence. "Sorry," he mumbled contritely, "never should have asked." The pilot was not the only one who was curious. When I began trying to make arrangements in Churchill for a commercial bush plane to fly me on into the interior, my innocent explanation of my purpose, together with the honest admission that I hadn't the slightest idea where, in the almost untraveled wilderness, I wanted to be set down, drew either hostile stares of disbelief or conspiratorial winks. However, I was not deliberately trying to be evasive. I was only trying to follow the operation order which had been laid down for me in Ottawa. Paragraph 3, Section C, Subparagraph 3. You will, immediately upon reaching Churchill, proceed by chartered air transport in a suitable direction for the requisite distance, and thereupon establish a base at a point where it has been ascertained there is an adequate wolf population, and where conditions generally are optimal to the furtherance of your operations. Although these instructions were firm in tone, they were rather lacking in specific direction, and I suppose it was only natural that half the population of Churchill should have concluded I was a member of a high-grade gang of gold ore thieves attempting to make contact with my fellow conspirators, while the other half thought I was a prospector with knowledge of a secret mine somewhere in the vast interior Barrens. Quite early in my inquiry, I was asked by an old trapper if, since I was a wolf enthusiast, I would like some wolf juice. I said I did not think I would relish the drink, but since I was a scientist and anything to do with wolves was grist to my mill, I was willing to have a go. The old man thereupon led me off to Churchill's only beer parlor, a place I would normally have avoided, of course, and introduced me to wolf juice, a mixture which consisted of something called moose brand beer, liberally adulterated with antifreeze alcohol obtained from the soldiers at the airbase. I also made an independent discovery. I discovered that when the laboratory alcohol with which I had been supplied was mixed sparingly with moose brand beer, a variety of wolf juice resulted which was positively ambrosial. Thoughtfully, I added 15 cases of moose brand to my desiderata. I also purchased several gallons of formaldehyde, which, as any undertaker will confirm, is at least as good a preservative of dead animal tissue as grain alcohol. The plane I eventually chartered was an outrageously decrepit bimotor built in 1938 as a military training aircraft. It had been discarded after long years of service, only to be resuscitated by a lanky, hollow-eyed ex-RAF pilot who had delusions about starting his own airline in the Canadian North. The next 3 days proved inauspicious for the flight. First, because of cloud cover at ground level, and secondly because the ski-equipped plane had developed a severe limp as a result of the collapse of one of the hydraulic cylinders of the landing gear. There was nothing we could do about the weather, but the plane's engineer discovered it was possible to restore the hydraulic cylinder to duty by filling it with seal oil. It still leaked, but the plane would remain upright for as long as 20 minutes at a time before keeling slowly over on its side again like a dying duck. On the morning of the 4th day, we prepared to depart. Because the plane could carry only a small load, I was forced to jettison some of my desiderata, including the useless canoe-cum-bathtub. I was able, however, to trade a gallon of alcohol for a 17-foot canvas-covered canoe in fair condition, and this, so the pilot assured me, we could carry with us, lashed under the belly of the aircraft. At this point, I played a somewhat underhanded trick on this obliging fellow. My moose brand had been amongst the gear set aside as non-essential, but one evening, by flashlight, I discovered that the whole 15 cases would fit nicely into the canoe, which, when tied tightly up against the plane's belly, betrayed nothing of the vital cargo which it carried. Although the pilot managed to get the aircraft into her own element, she did not seem particularly happy. She steadfastly refused to climb above 300 feet, and the revolution indicators for both engines remained fixed at about 3/4 of their proper readings. "No need to go higher anyway," the pilot bellowed cheerfully in my ear. "Wouldn't see the wolves. Keep your eyes skinned now." Craning my head to peer out of the cracked and mazed plexiglass window, I skinned my eyes as best I could, but with little result. We were flying in the midst of an opaque gray cloud, and frequently I was unable even to see the wingtip. I saw no wolves, nor any sign of wolves. We droned on for nearly 3 hours, during which we might as well have been submerged in a barrel of molasses for all we could see of the world below. At the end of this time, the pilot put the aircraft into a steep dive and at the same time yelled to me, "Going down now, only enough petrol to get home. Good wolf country around here, though, best kind." We emerged under the cloud at an altitude of something over 30 feet and discovered we were flying up a mile-wide valley between high rocky hills and over the surface of a frozen lake. Without an instant's hesitation, the pilot landed, and whatever I may have thought of his aeronautical ability previously, I was suitably impressed with this particular maneuver, for he landed on our one good ski. Not until the aircraft had lost almost all speed did he allow her to settle slowly over on her weak starboard leg. He did not even cut the engines. "This is it, chum," he said merrily. "Out you go now. Gotta be quick. Be dark before I get back to Churchill." The lethargic mechanic sprang to life, and in mere moments, so it seemed to me, my mountain of supplies was on the ice. The canoe had been cut loose, and the landing gear cylinder had once again been pumped back to the vertical. After a glance at the contents of the canoe, the pilot bent a sorrowful look upon me. "Not quite cricket. Ah, well, I suppose you'll need it. Cheery, Bob. Come back for you in the fall sometime if the old kite hasn't pranged. Not to worry, though. Sure to be lots of Eskimos around. They'll take you back to Churchill any time at all." "Thanks," I said meekly, "but just for my records, do you mind telling me where I am?" Sorry about that. Don't quite know myself. Say about 300 miles northwest of Churchill. Close enough. No maps of this country anyway. Well, toodaloo." The cabin door slammed shut. The engines did their best to roar in the prescribed manner, and the plane went bumping across the pressure ridges, lifted unwillingly, and vanished into the overcast. I had arrived safely at my base. As I looked about me at the stark and cloud-topped hills, the waste of pressure-rippled ice, and beyond the valley to the desolate and treeless roll of tundra, I had no doubt that this was excellent wolf country. Indeed, I suspected that many pairs of lupine eyes were already watching me with speculative interest. I burrowed into my mountain of gear, found the revolver, and then took stock of my situation. It didn't seem very prepossessing. True, I had apparently penetrated to the heart of the Keewatin Barrenlands, and I had established a kind of base, although its location on the lake ice, far from land, left much to be desired. So far, I had adhered strictly to the letter of my instructions, but the next paragraph in my operation order was a stickler. Para 3, Section C, Subpara 4. Immediately after establishing a permanent base, you will proceed, by means of canoe and utilizing waterways, to make an extensive general survey of the surrounding country, to a depth and in a manner which will be significant in statistical terms, in order to determine the range-population ratio of Canis lupus, and in order to establish contact with the study species. I was willing enough to carry on, as per instructions, but the ice underfoot had a solidity about it which suggested that canoeing would have to be deferred for several weeks, if not forever. Furthermore, without some alternative means of transport, I did not see how I could even begin the task of moving my mountain of gear to a permanent location on dry land. As to establishing contact with the study species, this seemed out of the question at the moment, unless the wolves themselves decided to take the initiative. It was a serious dilemma. My orders had been drawn up for me after detailed consultation with the Meteorological Service, which had assured my department that, normally, the lakes and rivers in the central Barrens could be expected to be clear of ice by the date of my arrival. My orientation course in Ottawa had taught me that one never questioned information emanating from another department, and if a field operation based on such information went awry, it was invariably the fault of the fellow in the field. Under the circumstances, there was only one thing I could do. I had no alternative but to seek new orders. Briskly, I went to work uncovering the portable radio and setting it up on top of a pile of boxes. I had not previously had time to examine this instrument, and on opening the instruction manual, I was a little taken aback to find that the model with which I had been supplied was intended for the use of forest rangers and could not normally be expected to work over ranges of more than 20 miles. Nevertheless, I connected the batteries, rigged the aerial, turned knobs, and pressed buttons according to instructions, and went on the air. For some reason known only to the Department of Transport, which licenses such mobile transmitters as mine, my call sign was Daisy May. For the next hour, Daisy May cried plaintively into the darkling subarctic skies, but without raising a whisper of a reply. I was almost ready to accept the pessimistic statement in the manual and give up the attempt as hopeless when I caught the faint echo of a human voice above the whistle and rustle of static in the earphones. Hastily I tuned the set until I could make out a gabble of words, which it took me some time to identify as Spanish. Since I realize that what I must now recount may strain the credulity of some of my listeners, and since I have no technical knowledge whatsoever about radio, I can do no more than put forward an explanation given to me later by an expert, together with the assurance that no mere biologist could possibly have invented the sequence of events which followed. The technical explanation embraces a mysterious phenomenon known as wave skip, whereby, because of a combination of atmospheric conditions, it is sometimes possible, particularly in the north, for very low-powered transmitters to span considerable distances. My set had outdone itself. The station I raised belonged to an amateur operator in Peru. His English was easily as imperfect as my Spanish, so that it was some time before we began to get through to each other, and even then he seemed convinced I was calling him from somewhere near Tierra del Fuego. I was beginning to feel exceedingly frustrated before the Peruvian finally agreed to take down the substance of my message to my chief and forward it by commercial means to Ottawa. By the time I had finished my business with Peru, it had begun to grow quite dark, and the surrounding hills seemed to be closing in on me. I had as yet seen no sign of wolves, but they were understandably very much on my mind. And when I glimpsed a flicker of distant movement near the valley mouth, I became even more wolf-conscious. By straining my hearing, I detected a faint but electrifying sound, one that I instantly recognized, for though I had never before heard it in the wild, I had heard it several times in cowboy films. It was unmistakably the howling of a wolf pack in full cry, and equally unmistakably, the pack was crying full in my direction. At least one of my problems appeared to have been solved. I was about to establish contact with the study species. The solution of this problem led directly to the discovery of several new ones, not the least of which was that there was only 6 rounds in my pistol, and I couldn't, for the life of me, remember where I had stowed the reserve ammunition. This was a matter of some moment, since I knew from my extensive reading on the subject that the number of individuals in a wolf pack can vary from 4 to 40. Furthermore, judging from the volume of sounds being made by the approaching animals, I suspected that this pack numbered closer to 400. The subarctic night was now hard upon me, and the wolves soon would be too. It was already so dark that I could not see them clearly enough to estimate their actual numbers or gauge their probable behavior pattern. I therefore decided I should retire underneath the upturned canoe, so that the presence of a human being would not be readily apparent, with its consequent tendency to induce atypical behavior in the beasts. Since I could no longer see what was happening, I had to rely upon my other senses. My ears kept me informed as the pack swept up at full speed, circled my pile of equipment once, and then rushed straight for the canoe. A terrific chorus of howls, barks, and yelps very nearly deafened me, and so confusing was the noise that I began to experience hallucinations, imagining I could hear the deep-throated roar of an almost human voice above the general tumult. The roar sounded rather like, "For Christ's sake, stop it, you goddamn sons of bitches!" At this point, there was much scuffling, an outburst of pained yelping, and then, miraculously, total silence. I had been trained for years to make accurate deductions from natural phenomena, but this situation was beyond me. I needed more data. Very cautiously, I put one eye to the narrow slit between the gunwale of the canoe and the ice below. At first, I could see nothing but wolf feet, scores of them. But then my glance fastened on another pair of feet, a single pair, which could have belonged to no wolf. My deductive abilities returned all of a rush. I lifted the side of the canoe, stuck out my head, and peered upward into the bewildered and rather apprehensive face of a young man clad all in caribou furs. Scattered around him and staring at me with deep suspicion were the 14 large and formidable huskies which made up his team. But of bona fide wolves, there was not one in sight. Naturally, I was disappointed that my first encounter with wolves should have turned out to be an encounter with non-wolves, but there were compensations. The young man who owned the dogs was, so it developed, a trapper of mixed Eskimo and white parentage who possessed a cabin a few miles away. It was ideally suited to serve me as a permanent base camp. Apart from a small band of Eskimos, including his mother's family, living 70 miles away to the north, this young man, whose name was Mike, was the only human inhabitant in an area of some 10,000 square miles. This was excellent news, for it ensured that my study of the wolves would not be adversely affected by human intrusions. Mike was at first inclined to treat me with some reserve, not to say suspicion. During his 18 years of life, he had never known an aircraft to land in his part of the Barren Lands, and indeed had only seen 2 or 3 planes before, and these had been passing high overhead. It was therefore difficult for him to absorb the fact that an aircraft which he had neither seen nor heard had landed me and my immense pile of equipment on the middle of his lake. In the beginning of our relationship, he leaned more toward a supernatural explanation of my presence, for he had learned enough about Christianity from his white trader father to be on his guard against the devil. Consequently, he took no chances. During the first few days, he carried his .30-30 rifle in his hands and kept his distance from me. But soon after I introduced him to wolf juice, he put the rifle away, having apparently decided that if I was the devil, my blandishments were too powerful to be resisted. Probably because he could not think what else to do with me, Mike led me off to his cabin that first night. Although it was hardly a palatial affair, being built of poles and roofed with decaying caribou hides, I saw at once that it would serve my purpose. Having been empowered by the department to hire native assistants, so long as the consequent expenditure did not exceed $3 a month, I promptly made a deal with Mike, giving him an official IOU for $10 to cover 3 months' accommodation in his cabin, as well as his services as guide and general factotum. I was aware that this was a generous payment in the light of the prevailing rates which government agencies, missions, and the trading companies paid the Arctic natives, but I felt my extravagance would be tolerated by the Treasury Department, in view of the fact that, without Mike's help, my own department stood to lose about $4,000 worth of equipment as soon as the lake ice melted. I suspect from the nature of subsequent events that the bargain I struck with Mike was rather one-sided, and that he may not have fully grasped its implications. But in any event, he provided the services of his dog team to help me move my supplies and equipment to his cabin. During the next several days, I was extremely busy unpacking my equipment and setting up my field laboratory, being obliged to usurp most of the limited space in the tiny cabin in the process. I had little time to spare for Mike, but I did notice that he seemed deeply preoccupied. However, since he had so far seemed to be naturally taciturn, except with his dogs, and because I did not feel it right on such short acquaintance to intrude into his personal affairs, I made no attempt to discover the nature of his distress. Nevertheless, I did occasionally try to divert him by offering demonstrations of some of my scientific equipment. These demonstrations seemed to fascinate him, although they did not have the desired effect of easing his distrait attitude, which, if anything, got worse. Shortly after I showed him the cyanide wolf getters and explained that not only were they instantly fatal, but almost impossible to detect, he began to display definite signs of irrational behavior. He took to carrying a long stick about with him, and before he would even sit down at the crude table for a meal, he would poke the chair, and sometimes even the plate of food, in a most peculiar way. He would also poke at his boots and clothing before picking them up in the morning when he was getting dressed. On another occasion, when I showed him 4 gross of mousetraps with which I intended to collect small mammals to be used in determining the identification of animal remains found in wolf stomachs, and then explained the method of boiling a mouse skeleton in order to prepare it as a museum specimen, he departed the cabin without a word and refused to take his meals with me from that time forward. The following afternoon, when I returned from setting out a trapline for mice, I found him in the cabin packing his equipment as if for an extended journey. In a voice so low and rapid that I had difficulty understanding him, he explained that he had been urgently called away to visit his sick mother at the camp of the Eskimos and would probably be gone for some time. With that, he rushed out to where his team stood ready harnessed, and, without another word, departed at a furious pace into the north. I'm still at a loss to understand how Mike knew his mother was ill. As I was a newcomer to the Barrens, it behooved me to familiarize myself with the country in a cautious manner. Hence, on my first expedition afield, I contented myself with making a circular tour on a radius of about 300 yards from the cabin. This expedition revealed little, except the presence of 400 or 500 caribou skeletons. Indeed, the entire area surrounding the cabin seemed to be carpeted in caribou bones. Since I knew from my researches in Churchill that trappers never shot caribou, I could only assume that these animals had been killed by wolves. This was a sobering conclusion. Assuming that the density of the caribou kill was uniform over the whole country, the sample I had seen indicated that wolves must kill, on the average, about 20 million caribou a year in Keewatin alone. After this dismaying tour of the boneyard, it was 3 days before I found time for another trip afield. Carrying a rifle and wearing my revolver, I went a quarter mile on this second expedition, but saw no wolves. However, to my surprise, I observed that the density of caribou remains decreased in an almost geometric ratio to the distance from the cabin. Sorely puzzled by the fact that the wolves seemed to have chosen to commit their worst slaughter so close to a human habitation, I resolved to question Mike about it, if or when I saw him again. Meantime, spring had come to the Barrens with volcanic violence. The snows melted so fast that the frozen rivers could not carry the melted water, which flowed 6 feet deep on top of the ice. Finally, the ice let go with a thunderous explosion. Then it promptly jammed, and in short order, the river beside which I was living had entered into the cabin, bringing with it the accumulated refuse left by 14 huskies during a long winter. Eventually, the jam broke and the waters subsided, but the cabin had lost its charm, for the debris on the floor was a foot thick and somewhat repellent. I decided to pitch my tent on a gravel ridge above the cabin, and here I was vainly trying to go to sleep that evening when I became aware of unfamiliar sounds. Sitting bolt upright, I listened intently. The sounds were coming from just across the river to the north, and they were a weird medley of whines, whimpers, and small howls. My grip on the rifle slowly relaxed. If there is one thing at which scientists are adept, it is learning from experience. I was not to be fooled twice. The cries were obviously those of a husky, probably a young one, and I deduced that it must be one of Mike's dogs that had got lost, retraced its way to the cabin, and was now begging for someone to come and be nice to it. Well, I was delighted. If that pup needed a friend, a chum, I was its man. I climbed hastily into my clothes, ran down to the river bank, launched the canoe, and paddled lustily for the far bank. The pup had never ceased its mournful plaint, and I was about to call out reassuringly when it occurred to me that an unfamiliar human voice might frighten it. I decided to stalk it instead, and to betray my presence only when I was close enough for soothing murmurs. From the nature of the sounds, I had assumed the dog was only a few yards away from the far bank, but as I made my way in the dim half-light over broken boulders and across gravel ridges, the sounds seemed to remain at the same volume, while I appeared to be getting no closer. I assumed the pup was retreating, perhaps out of shyness. In my anxiety not to startle it away entirely, I still kept quiet, even when the whimpering wails stopped, leaving me uncertain about the right direction to go. However, I saw a steep ridge looming ahead of me, and I suspected that, once I had gained its summit, I would have a clear enough view to enable me to locate the lost animal. As I neared the crest of the ridge, I got down on my stomach, practicing the fieldcraft I had learned in the Boy Scouts, and cautiously inched my way the last few feet. My head came slowly over the crest, and there was my quarry. He was lying down, evidently resting after his mournful sing-song, and his nose was about 6 feet from mine. We stared at one another in silence. I do not know what went on in his massive skull, but my head was full of the most disturbing thoughts. I was peering straight into the amber gaze of a fully grown Arctic wolf who probably weighed more than I did, and who was certainly a lot better versed in close combat techniques than I would ever be. For some seconds, neither of us moved, but continued to stare hypnotically into one another's eyes. The wolf was the first to break the spell. With a spring which would have done justice to a Russian dancer, he leapt about a yard straight into the air and came down running. The textbooks say a wolf can run 25 miles an hour, but this one did not appear to be running so much as flying low. Within seconds, he had vanished from my sight. My own reaction was not so dramatic, although I may very well have set some sort of a record for a cross-country traverse myself. My return over the river was accomplished with such verve that I paddled the canoe almost her full length up on the beach on the other side. Then, remembering my responsibilities to my scientific supplies, I entered the cabin, barred the door, and regardless of the discomfort caused by the stench of the debris on the floor, made myself as comfortable as I could on top of the table for the balance of the short-lived night. It had been a strenuous interlude, but I could congratulate myself that I had, at last, established contact, no matter how briefly, with the study species. The next morning I began to suspect that I had muffed an opportunity, one which might, moreover, never again recur. It was borne in upon me that I should have followed the wolf and endeavored to gain his confidence, or at least to convince him that I harbored no ill will toward his kind. Filled with resolution, I packed some grub in a haversack, saw to the supply of ammunition for my rifle and revolver, slung my binoculars around my neck, and set out to make good my failure of the previous evening. My plan was straightforward. I intended to go directly to the spot where I had seen the wolf disappear, pick up his trail, and follow until I found him. The going was rough and rocky at first, and I took a good deal longer to cover the intervening ground than the wolf had done, but eventually I scaled the low crest where I had last seen him, or her, and ahead of me I found a vast expanse of boggy muskeg which promised well for tracks. And indeed I found a set of footprints almost immediately, leading off across a patch of chocolate-colored bog. I should have felt overjoyed, yet somehow I did not. The truth is that my first sight of the wolf's paw print was a revelation for which I was quite unprepared. It is one thing to read in a textbook that the footprints of an Arctic wolf measure 6 inches in diameter, but it is quite another thing to see them laid out before you in all their bald immensity. It has a dampening effect on one's enthusiasm. The mammoth prints before me, combined as they were with a 40-inch stride, suggested that the beast I was proposing to pursue was built on approximately the scale of a grizzly bear. I studied those prints for quite a long time, and might perhaps have studied them for even longer had I not made the fortunate discovery that I had neglected to bring my pocket compass with me. Since it would have been obviously foolhardy to proceed into an unmarked wilderness without it, I regretfully decided to return to the cabin. When I got back to Mike's, the compass was not where I had left it. In fact, I couldn't remember where I had left it, or even if I had seen it since leaving Ottawa. It was an impasse. But in order not to waste my time, I got down one of the standard works with which the department had equipped me and consulted the section on wolves. I had, of course, read this section many times before, but some of the salient facts had evidently failed to impress themselves clearly on my mind. Now, with my capacity for mental imagery sharpened by my first look at a set of real wolf tracks, I reread the piece with new interest and appreciation. Arctic wolves, the author informed me, were the largest of the many subspecies or races of Canis lupus. Specimens had been examined which measured 8 feet 7 inches from tip of nose to tip of tail, and which stood 42 inches high at the shoulders. An adult of the Arctic race could eat, and presumably did on favorable occasions, 30 pounds of raw meat at a sitting. The teeth were massive in construction and capable of both rending and grinding action, which enables the owner to dismember the largest mammals with ease and to crush even the strongest bones. The section closed with the following succinct remarks. The wolf is a savage, powerful killer. It is one of the most feared and hated animals known to man, and with excellent reason. The reason was not given, but it would have been superfluous in any case. I was very thoughtful for the balance of the day. and there were moments when I wondered if my hopes of gaining the confidence of the wolves might not be overly optimistic. As to demonstrating that I bore them no ill will, this I felt would be easy enough to do, but would be of little value unless the wolves felt like reciprocating. Next morning, I undertook to clean up the Stygian mess in the cabin, and in the process I uncovered my compass. I set it on the windowsill while I continued with my work, but the sun caught its brass surface, and it glittered at me so accusingly that I resigned myself to making another effort to restore the lost contact between me and the wolves. My progress on this second safari was even slower, since I was carrying my rifle, shotgun, pistol and pistol belt, a small hatchet, my hunting knife, together with a flask of wolf juice in case I fell into one of the icy streams. It was a hot day, and spring days in the subarctic can be nearly as hot as in the tropics. The first mosquitoes were already heralding the approach of the sky-filling swarms which would soon make travel on the Barrens a veritable trip through hell. I located the wolf tracks and resolutely set out upon the trail. It led directly across the muskeg for several miles, but although the wolf had sunk in only 3 or 4 inches, my steps sank in until I reached solid ice a foot beneath the surface. It was with great relief that I finally breasted another gravel ridge and lost all trace of the wolf tracks. My attempts to find them again were perfunctory. As I gazed around me at the morose world of rolling muskeg and frost-shattered stone that stretched uninterruptedly to a horizon so distant it might as well have been the horizon of the sea, I felt lonelier than I had ever felt in all my life. I found a niche amongst some lichen-covered rocks, and having firmly jammed myself into it, ate and drank my lunch. Then I picked up the binoculars and began to scan the barren landscape for some sign of life. Directly in front of me was the ice-covered bay of a great lake, and on the far side of this bay was something which at least relieved the somber monochrome of the muskeg coloring. It was a yellow sand esker, rising to a height of 50 or 60 feet, and winding sinuously away into the distance like a gigantic snake. These barrenland eskers are the inverted beds of long-vanished rivers which once flowed through and over the glaciers that 10,000 years ago covered the Keewatin Barrens to a depth of several thousand feet. When the ice melted, sandy riverbeds were deposited on the land below, where they now provide almost the sole visual relief in the bleak monotony of the tundra plains. I gazed at this one with affection, studying it closely, and as I swept it with my glasses, I saw something move. The distance was great, but the impression I had was of someone just the other side of the esker crest, waving an arm above his head. Much excited, I stumbled to my feet and trotted along the ridge to its termination on the shore of the bay. I was then not more than 300 yards from the esker, and when I got my breath back, I took another look through the glasses. The object I had previously glimpsed was still in view, but now it looked like a white feather boa being vehemently waved by person or persons unknown. It was a most inexplicable object, and nothing I had ever heard of in my study of natural history seemed to fit. As I stared in perplexity, the first boa was joined by a second, also waving furiously, and both boas began to move slowly along, parallel to the crest of the esker. Then, without warning, both boas turned toward me, began rising higher and higher, and finally revealed themselves as the tails of 2 wolves proceeding to top the esker. The esker overlooked my position on the bay shore, and I felt as nakedly exposed as the lady in the famous brassiere advertisement. Hunkering down to make myself as small as possible, I wormed my way into the rocks and did my best to be unobtrusive. I need not have worried. The wolves paid no attention to me, if indeed they even saw me. They were far too engrossed in their own affairs, which, as I slowly and incredulously began to realize, were at that moment centered around the playing of a game of tag. It was difficult to believe my eyes. Although clearly adults, they were romping like a pair of month-old pups. The smaller wolf, who soon gave concrete evidence that she was a female, took the initiative. Putting her head down on her forepaws and elevating her posterior in a most undignified manner, she suddenly pounced towards the much larger male, whom I now recognized as my acquaintance of 2 days earlier. He, in his attempt to evade her, tripped and went sprawling. Instantly she was upon him, nipping him smartly in the backside, before leaping away to run around him in frenzied circles. The male scrambled to his feet and gave chase, but only by the most strenuous effort was he able to close the gap until he, in his turn, was able to nip her backside. Thereupon, the roles were again reversed, and the female began to pursue the male, who led her on a wild scrabble up, over, down, and back across the esker, until finally both wolves lost their footing on the steep slope and went skidding down it, inextricably locked together. When they reached the bottom, they separated, shook the sand out of their hair, and stood, panting heavily, almost nose to nose. Then the female reared up and quite literally embraced the male with both forepaws, while she proceeded to smother him in long-tongued kisses. The male appeared to be enduring this overt display of affection rather than enjoying it. He kept trying to avert his head, but to no avail. Involuntarily, I felt my sympathy warming toward him, for in truth it was a disgusting exhibition of wanton passion. Nevertheless, he bore it with what stoicism he could muster until the female tired. Turning from him, she climbed halfway up the esker slope and disappeared. She seemed to have vanished off the face of the earth without leaving a trace behind her. Not until I swung the glasses back toward a dark shadow in a fold of the esker near where I had last seen her did I understand. The dark shadow was the mouth of a cave or den, and the female wolf had almost certainly gone into it. I was so elated by the realization that I had not only located a pair of wolves, but by an incredible stroke of fortune had found their den as well, that I forgot all caution and ran to a nearby knoll in order to gain a better view of the den mouth. The male wolf, who had been loafing about at the foot of the esker after the departure of his wife, instantly saw me. In 3 or 4 bounds he reached the ridge of the esker, where he stood facing me in an attitude of tense and threatening vigilance. As I looked up at him, my sense of exhilaration waned rather rapidly. He no longer seemed like a playful pup, but had metamorphosed into a magnificent engine of destruction, which impressed me so much that the neck of my flask positively rattled against my teeth. I decided I had better not disturb the wolf family any more that day, for fear of upsetting them and perhaps forcing them to move away, so I withdrew. It was not an easy withdrawal, for one of the most difficult things I know of is to walk backward up a broken rocky slope for 3/4 of a mile, encumbered, as I was, by the complex hardware of a scientist's trade. The events of the day before were encouraging enough to tempt me to visit the den again next morning. But this time, instead of the shotgun and the hatchet, I still retained the rifle, pistol, and hunting knife, I carried a high-powered periscopic telescope and a tripod on which to mount it. It was a fine, sunny morning, with enough breeze to keep the mosquito vanguard down. When I reached the bay where the esker was, I chose a prominent knoll of rocks some 400 yards from the den, behind which I could set up my telescope so that its objective lenses peered over the crest, but left me in hiding. Using consummate fieldcraft, I approached the chosen observation point in such a manner that the wolves could not possibly have seen me, and since the wind was from them to me, I was assured they would have had no suspicion of my arrival. When all was in order, I focused the telescope, but to my chagrin, I could see no wolves, nor any indication that wolves were about, or even ever had been. This was discouraging, for it had begun to dawn on me that all of the intricate study plans and schedules which I had drawn up were not going to be of much use without a great deal of cooperation on the part of the wolves. In country as open and as vast as this one was, the prospects of getting within visual range of a wolf, except by the luckiest of accidents, and I had already had more than my ration of these, were negligible. I realized that if this was not a wolf's den I had found, I had about as much chance of locating an actual den in this faceless wilderness as I had of finding a diamond mine. Glumly, I went back to my unproductive survey through the telescope. The esker remained deserted. The hot sand began sending up heat waves, which gave me eye strain. By 2 p.m., I had given up hope. There seemed no further point in concealment, so I got stiffly to my feet and prepared to relieve myself. Now, it's a remarkable fact that a man, even though he may be alone in a small boat in mid-ocean or isolated in the midst of the trackless forest, finds that the very process of unbuttoning causes him to become peculiarly sensitive to the possibility that he may be under observation. At this critical juncture, none but the most self-assured man, no matter how certain he may be of his privacy, can refrain from casting a surreptitious glance around to reassure himself that he really is alone. To say I was chagrined to discover I was not alone would be an understatement, for sitting directly behind me and not 20 yards away were the missing wolves. They appeared to be quite relaxed and comfortable, as if they had been sitting there behind my back for hours. The big male seemed a trifle bored, but the female's gaze was fixed on me with what I took to be an expression of unabashed and even prurient curiosity. The human psyche is truly an amazing thing. Under almost any other circumstances, I would probably have been panic-stricken, and I think few would have blamed me for it. But these were not ordinary circumstances, and my reaction was one of violent indignation. Outraged, I turned my back on the watching wolves, and with fingers which were shaking with vexation, hurriedly did up my buttons. When decency, if not my dignity, had been restored, I rounded on those wolves with a virulence which surprised even me. "Shoo!" I screamed at them. "What the hell do you think you're at, you peeping toms? Get away, for heaven's sake!" The wolves were startled. They sprang to their feet, glanced at each other with a wild surmise, then trotted off, passed down a draw, and disappeared in the direction of the esker. They did not once look back. With their departure, I experienced a reaction of another kind. The realization that they had been sitting almost within jumping distance of my unprotected back for God knows how long set up such a turmoil of the spirit that I had to give up all thought of carrying on where my discovery of the wolves had forced me to leave off. Suffering from both mental and physical strain, I hurriedly packed my gear and set out for the cabin. My thoughts that evening were confused. True, my prayer had been answered, and the wolves had certainly cooperated by reappearing, but, on the other hand, I was becoming prey to a small but nagging doubt as to just who was watching whom. I felt that I, because of my specific superiority as a member of Homo sapiens, together with my intensive technical training, was entitled to pride of place. The sneaking suspicion that this pride had been denied, and that, in point of fact, I was the one who was under observation, had an unsettling effect upon my ego. In order to establish my ascendancy, once and for all, I determined to visit the wolf esker itself the following morning and make a detailed examination of the presumed den. I decided to go by canoe, since the rivers were now clear, and the rafting lake ice was being driven offshore by a stiff northerly breeze. It was a fine, leisurely trip to Wolf House Bay, as I had now named it. The annual spring caribou migration north from the forested areas of Manitoba toward the distant tundra plains near Dubont Lake was underway, and from my canoe I could see countless skeins of caribou crisscrossing the muskegs and rolling hills in all directions. No wolves were in evidence as I neared the esker, and I assumed they were away hunting a caribou for lunch. I ran the canoe ashore and, fearfully laden with cameras, guns, binoculars, and other gear, laboriously climbed the shifting sands of the esker to the shadowy place where the female wolf had disappeared. En route, I found unmistakable proof that this esker was, if not the home, at least one of the favorite promenades of the wolves. It was liberally strewn with droppings and covered with wolf tracks, which in many places formed well-defined paths. The den was located in a small wadi in the esker, and was so well concealed that I was on the point of walking past without seeing it when a series of small squeaks attracted my attention. I stopped and turned to look, and there, not 15 feet below me, were 4 small, gray beasties engaged in a free-for-all wrestling match. At first I did not recognize them for what they were. The fat fox faces with pinprick ears, the butterball bodies as round as pumpkins, the short, bowed legs, and the tiny upthrust sprigs of tails were so far from my conception of a wolf that my brain refused to make the logical connection. Suddenly, one of the pups caught my scent. He stopped in the midst of attempting to bite off a brother's tail and turned smoky blue eyes up toward me. What he saw evidently intrigued him. Lurching free of the scrimmage, he padded toward me with a rolling, wobbling gait. But a flea bit him unexpectedly before he had gone far, and he had to sit down to scratch it. At this instant, an adult wolf let loose a full-throated howl, vibrant with alarm and warning, and not more than 50 yards away. The idyllic scene exploded into frenzied action. The pups became gray streaks which vanished into the gaping darkness of the den mouth. I spun around to face the adult wolf. lost my footing, and started to skid down the loose slope toward the den. In trying to regain my balance, I thrust the muzzle of the rifle deep into the sand, where it stuck fast until the carrying strap dragged it free as I slid rapidly away from it. I fumbled wildly at my revolver, but so cluttered was I with cameras and equipment straps that I did not succeed in getting the weapon clear as, accompanied by a growing avalanche of sand, I shot past the den mouth, over the lip of the main ridge, and down the full length of the esker slope. Miraculously, I kept my feet, but only by dint of superhuman contortions, during which I was alternately bent forward like a skier going over a jump, or leaning backward at such an acute angle I thought my backbone was going to snap. It must have been quite a show. When I got myself straightened out and glanced back up the esker, it was to see 3 adult wolves ranged side by side like spectators in the royal box, all peering down at me with expressions of incredulous delight. I lost my temper. Now, this is something a scientist seldom does, but I lost mine. My dignity had been too heavily eroded during the past several days, and my scientific detachment was no longer equal to the strain. With a snarl of exasperation, I raised the rifle, but fortunately, the thing was so clogged with sand that when I pressed the trigger, nothing happened. The wolves did not appear alarmed until they saw me begin to dance up and down in helpless fury, waving the useless rifle and hurling imprecations at their cocked ears, whereupon they exchanged quizzical looks and silently withdrew out of my sight. I too withdrew, for I was in no fit mental state to carry on with my exacting scientific duties. To tell the truth, I was in no fit mental state to do anything much except hurry home to Mike's and seek solace for my tattered nerves and frayed vanity in the bottom of a jar of wolf juice. I had a long and salutary session with the stuff that night, and as my spiritual bruises became less painful under its healing influence, I reviewed the incidents of the past few days. Inescapably, the realization was being borne in upon my preconditioned mind that the centuries-old and universally accepted human concept of wolf character was a palpable lie. On 3 separate occasions in less than a week, I had been completely at the mercy of these savage killers. But far from attempting to tear me limb from limb, they had displayed a restraint verging on contempt, even when I invaded their home and appeared to be posing a direct threat to the young pups. This much was obvious, yet I was still strangely reluctant to let the myth go down the drain. Part of my reluctance was no doubt due to the thought that by discarding the accepted concepts of wolf nature, I would be committing scientific treason. Part of it to the knowledge that recognition of the truth would deprive my mission of its fine aura of danger and high adventure. And not the least part of my reluctance was probably due to my unwillingness to accept the fact that I had been made to look like a blithering idiot, not by my fellow man, but by mere brute beasts. When I emerged from my session with the wolf juice the following morning, I was somewhat the worse for wear in a physical sense, but cleansed and purified spiritually. I had wrestled with my devils, and I had won. I had made my decision that, from this hour onward, I would go open-minded into the lupine world, and learn to see and know the wolves, not for what they were supposed to be, but for what they actually were. During the next several weeks, I put my decision into effect with the thoroughness for which I have always been noted. I went completely to the wolves. To begin with, I set up a den of my own as near to the wolves as I could conveniently get without disturbing the even tenor of their lives too much. After all, I was a stranger and an unwolf-like one, so I did not feel I should go too far too fast. Abandoning Mike's cabin, with considerable relief, since as the days warmed up, so did the smell, I took a tiny tent and set it up on the shore of the bay immediately opposite the den esker. I kept my camping gear to the barest minimum. A small Primus stove, a stew pot, a tea kettle, and a sleeping bag were the essentials. I took no weapons of any kind. The big telescope was set up in the mouth of the tent in such a way that I could observe the den by day or night without even getting out of my sleeping bag. During the first days of my sojourn with the wolves, I stayed inside the tent except for brief and necessary visits to the out-of-doors, which I always undertook when the wolves were not in sight. The point of this personal concealment was to allow the animals to get used to the tent and to accept it as only another bump on a very bumpy piece of terrain. Later, when the mosquito population reached full flowering, I stayed in the tent practically all of the time, unless there was a strong wind blowing. For the most bloodthirsty beasts in the Arctic are not wolves, but the mosquitoes. My precautions against disturbing the wolves were superfluous. It had required a week for me to get their measure, but they must have taken mine at our first meeting. And while there was nothing overtly disdainful in their evident assessment of me, they managed to ignore my presence, and indeed my very existence, with a thoroughness which was somehow disconcerting. By this time I had learned a good deal about my wolfish neighbors. One of the salient facts which had emerged was that they were not nomadic roamers, as is almost universally believed, but were settled beasts, and the possessors of a large, permanent estate with very definite boundaries. The territory owned by my wolf family comprised more than 100 square miles, bounded on one side by a river, but otherwise not delimited by geographical features. Nevertheless, there were boundaries, clearly indicated in wolfish fashion. Anyone who has observed a dog doing his neighborhood rounds and leaving his personal mark on each convenient post will have already guessed how the wolves marked out their property. Once a week, more or less, the clan made the rounds of the family lands and freshened up the boundary markers. Once I had become aware of the strong feeling of property rights which existed amongst the wolves, I decided to use this knowledge to make them at least recognize my existence. One evening, after the adults had gone off for their regular nightly hunt, I staked out a property claim of my own, embracing perhaps 3 acres, but including a 100-yard-long section of the wolves' path. In order to ensure that my claim would not be overlooked, I felt obliged to make a property mark on stones, clumps of moss, and patches of vegetation at intervals of not more than 15 feet around the entire circumference of my claim. This took several gallons of tea and most of the night. But before dawn I retired, somewhat exhausted, to observe results. When the leading male of the clan appeared over the ridge behind me, as usual he did not deign to glance at the tent. But when he reached the point where my property line intersected the trail, he stopped as abruptly as if he had run into an invisible wall. Cautiously he extended his nose and sniffed at one of my marked bushes. He didn't seem to know what to make of it or what to do about it. After a minute of complete indecision, he backed away a few yards and sat down. And then, finally, he looked directly at the tent and at me. It was a long, thoughtful, considering sort of look. Having achieved my objective, that of forcing at least one of the wolves to take cognizance of my existence, I now began to wonder if, in my ignorance, I had transgressed some unknown wolf law of major importance and would now have to pay for my temerity. I began to grow fidgety, for I disliked staring matches, and in this particular case I was up against a master whose yellow glare seemed to become more baleful as I attempted to stare him down. In an effort to break the impasse, I loudly cleared my throat, then turned my back on the wolf, for 1/10 of a second, to indicate as clearly as possible that I found his continued scrutiny impolite, if not actually offensive. He appeared to take the hint. Getting to his feet, he had another sniff at my marker, and then seemed to make up his mind. Briskly, and with an air of decision, he began a systematic tour of the area I had staked out as my own. As he came to each boundary marker, he sniffed it once or twice, then carefully placed his mark on the outside of each clump of grass or stone. The task completed, he rejoined the path at the point where I'd left my property and trotted off toward his home, leaving me with a good deal to occupy my thoughts. Once it had been formally established, and its existence ratified by the wolves themselves, my little enclave in their territory remained inviolate. Never again did a wolf trespass on my personal domain. Any lingering doubts I might have had as to my safety dissolved, and I was free to devote all my attention to the study of the beasts themselves. Very early in my observations, I discovered that they led a well-regulated life, although they were not slavish adherents to fixed schedules. Early in the evenings, the males went off to work. They might depart at 4 o'clock, or they might delay until 6 or 7, but sooner or later off they went on the nightly hunt. During this hunt they ranged far afield, although always, as far as I could tell, staying within the limits of the family territory. I estimated that during a normal hunt they covered 30 or 40 miles before dawn. When times were hard, they probably covered even greater distances, since on some occasions they did not get home until the afternoon. During the balance of the daylight hours, they slept, but in their own peculiarly wolfish way, which consisted of curling up for short wolf naps of from 5 to 10 minutes duration, after each of which they would take a quick look about and then turn around once or twice before dozing off again. The females and the pups led a more diurnal life. Once the males had departed in the evening, the female usually went into the den and stayed there, emerging only occasionally for a breath of air, a drink, or sometimes for a visit to the meat cache for a snack. This cache deserves special mention. No food was ever stored or left close to the den, and only enough was brought in at one time for immediate consumption. Any surplus from a hunt was carried to the cache, which was located in a jumble of boulders half a mile from the den and stuffed into crevices, primarily for the use of the nursing female, who, of course, could not join the male wolves on extended hunting trips. During the day, while the male wolves took it easy, the female would be reasonably active about her household chores. Emerging boisterously from the close confines of the den, the pups also became active, to the point of total exhaustion. Thus, throughout the entire 24-hour period, there was usually something going on, or at least the expectation of something, to keep me glued to the telescope. As I grew more completely attuned to their daily round of family life, I found it increasingly difficult to maintain an impersonal attitude toward the wolves. No matter how hard I tried to regard them with scientific objectivity, I could not resist the impact of their individual personalities. Because he reminded me irresistibly of a royal gentleman for whom I worked as a simple soldier during the war, I found myself calling the father of the family George, even though in my notebooks he was austerely identified only as Wolf A. George was a massive and eminently regal beast whose coat was silver white. He was about a third larger than his mate, but he hardly needed this extra bulk to emphasize his air of masterful certainty. George had presence. His dignity was unassailable, yet he was by no means aloof. Conscientious to a fault, thoughtful of others, and affectionate within reasonable bounds, he was the kind of father whose idealized image appears in many wistful books of human family reminiscences, but whose real prototype has seldom paced the earth upon two legs. George was, in brief, the kind of father every son longs to acknowledge as his own. His wife was equally memorable. A slim, almost pure white wolf with a thick ruff around her face and wide-spaced, slightly slanted eyes, she seemed the picture of a minx. Beautiful, ebullient, passionate to a degree, and devilish when the mood was on her, she hardly looked like the epitome of motherhood. Yet there could have been no better mother anywhere. I found myself calling her Angeline, although I have never been able to trace the origin of that name in the murky depths of my own subconscious. I respected and liked George very much, but I became deeply fond of Angeline and lived in hopes that I might somewhere find a human female who embodied all her virtues. Angeline and George seemed an ideal couple. As far as I could tell, they never quarreled, and the delight with which they greeted each other after even a short absence was obviously unfeigned. They were extremely affectionate with one another. However, physical lovemaking enters into the lives of a pair of mated wolves only during a period of 2 or 3 weeks early in the spring, usually in March. Virgin females, and they are all virginal until their second year, then mate. But unlike dogs, who have adopted many of the habits of their human owners, wolf bitches mate with only a single male and mate for life. Whereas the phrase, "till death do us part," is one of the more amusing mockeries in the nuptial arrangements of a large proportion of the human race, with wolves it is a simple fact. Wolves are monogamous, and although I do not necessarily consider this an admirable trait, it does make the reputation for unbridled promiscuity which we have bestowed on the wolf somewhat hypocritical. While it was not possible for me to know with certainty how long George and Angeline had been mated, I was later to discover from Mike that they had been together for at least 5 years, or the equivalent of 30 years in terms of the relative longevity of wolves and men. Mike and the Eskimos recognized the wolves in their area as familiar individuals, and the Eskimos, though not Mike, held the wolves in such high regard that they would not have thought of killing them or doing them an injury. Not only were George, Angeline, and other members of the family well known to the Eskimos, but the site of their den had been known for some 40 or 50 years, during which time generations of wolves had raised families there. One factor concerning the organization of the family mystified me very much at first. During my early visit to the den, I had seen 3 adult wolves, and during the first few days of observing the den, I had again glimpsed the odd wolf out several times. He posed a major conundrum, for while I could accept the idea of a contented domestic group consisting of mated male and female and a bevy of pups, I had not yet progressed far enough into the wolf world to be able to explain or to accept the apparent existence of an eternal triangle. The third wolf was definitely a character. He was smaller than George, not so lithe and vigorous, and with a gray overcast to his otherwise white coat. He became Uncle Albert to me after the first time I saw him with the pups. The 6th morning of my vigil had dawned bright and sunny, and Angeline and the pups took advantage of the good weather. Hardly was the sun risen, at 3 a.m., when they all left the den and adjourned to a nearby sandy knoll. Here the pups worked over their mother with an enthusiasm which would certainly have driven any human female into hysterics. They were hungry, but they were also full to the ears with hellery. 2 of them did their best to chew off Angeline's tail, worrying it and fighting over it until I thought I could actually see her fur flying, while the other 2 did what they could to remove her ears. Angeline stood it with noble stoicism for about an hour, and then, somewhat disheveled, she attempted to protect herself by sitting on her tail and tucking her mauled head down between her legs. This was a fruitless effort. The pups went for her feet, 1 to each paw, and I was treated to the spectacle of the demon killer of the wilds, trying desperately to cover her paws, her tail, and her head at one and the same instant. Eventually she gave it up. Harassed beyond endurance, she leapt away from her brood and raced to the top of a high sand ridge behind the den. The 4 pups rolled cheerfully off in pursuit, but before they could reach her, she gave vent to a most peculiar cry. The whole question of wolf communication was to intrigue me more and more as time went on, but on this occasion I was still laboring under the delusion that complex communications amongst animals other than man do not exist. I could make nothing definite of Angeline's high-pitched and yearning whine-come-howl. I did, however, detect a plaintive quality in it which made my sympathies go out to her. I was not alone. Within seconds of her cri de coeur, and before the mob of pups could reach her, a savior appeared. It was the 3rd wolf. He had been sleeping in a bed hollowed in the sand at the southern end of the esker, where it dipped down to disappear beneath the waters of the bay. I had not known he was there until I saw his head come up. He jumped to his feet, shook himself, and trotted straight towards the den, intercepting the pups as they prepared to scale the last slope to reach their mother. I watched fascinated as he used his shoulder to bowl the leading pup over on its back and send it skidding down the lower slope toward the den. Having broken the charge, he then nipped another pup lightly on its fat behind, then shepherded the lot of them back to what I later came to recognize as the playground area. I hesitate to put human words into a wolf's mouth, but the effect of what followed was crystal clear. "If it's a workout you kids want," he might have said, "then I'm your wolf." And so he was. For the next hour he played with the pups with as much energy as if he was still one himself. The games were varied, but many of them were quite recognizable. Tag was the standby, and Albert was always it. Leaping, rolling, and weaving amongst the pups, he never left the area of the nursery knoll, while at the same time leading the youngsters such a chase that they eventually gave up. Albert looked them over for a moment, and then, after a quick glance toward the crest, where Angeline was now lying in a state of peaceful relaxation, he flung himself in amongst the tired pups, sprawled on his back, and invited mayhem. They were game. One by one they roused and went into battle. Some of them tried to choke the life out of Albert, although their small teeth, sharp as they were, could never have penetrated his heavy ruff. One of them, in an excess of infantile sadism, turned its back on him and pawed a shower of sand into his face. The others took to leaping as high into the air as their bowed little legs would propel them, coming down with a satisfying thump on Albert's vulnerable belly. In between jumps, they tried to chew the life out of whatever vulnerable parts came to tooth. I began to wonder how much he could stand. Evidently, he could stand a lot, for not until the pups were totally exhausted and had collapsed into complete somnolence did he get to his feet, careful not to step on the small, sprawled forms, and disengage himself. Even then he did not return to the comfort of his own bed, which he had undoubtedly earned after a night of hard hunting, but settled himself instead on the edge of the nursery knoll, where he began wolf napping, taking a quick look at the pups every few minutes to make sure they were still safely near at hand. His true relationship to the rest of the family was still uncertain, but as far as I was concerned, he had become, and would remain, good old Uncle Albert. After some weeks of study, I still seemed to be as far as ever from solving the salient problem of how the wolves made their living. This was a vital problem, since solving it in a way satisfactory to my employers was the reason for my expedition. Caribou are the only large herbivores to be found in any numbers in the Arctic barren lands. Although once as numerous as the plains buffalo, they had shown a catastrophic decrease during the 3 or 4 decades preceding my trip to the Barrens. Evidence obtained by various government agencies from hunters, trappers, and traders seemed to prove that the plunge of the caribou population was primarily due to the depredation of the wolf. It therefore must have seemed a safe bet to the politicians cum scientists who had employed me that a research study of wolf-caribou relationships in the Barrens would uncover incontrovertible proof with which to damn the wolf, and to provide a more than sufficient excuse for the adoption of a general campaign for his extirpation. I did my duty, but although I searched diligently for evidence that would please my superiors, I had so far found none, nor, did it appear, was I likely to. Toward the end of June, the last of the migrating caribou herds had passed Wolfhouse Bay, heading for the high barrens some 200 or 300 miles to the north, where they would spend the summer. Whatever my wolves were going to eat during those long months, and whatever they were going to feed their hungry pups, it would not be caribou, for the caribou were gone. But, if not caribou, what then? I canvassed all the other possibilities I could think of, but there seemed to be no source of food available which would be adequate to satisfy the appetites of 3 adult and 4 young wolves. The days passed, and the mystery deepened. To make the problem even more inscrutable, the wolves seemed well fed. And, to baffle me to the point of near insanity, the 2 male wolves went off hunting every night and returned every morning, but never appeared to bring anything home. About this time, I began having trouble with mice. The vast expanses of spongy sphagnum bog provided an ideal milieu for several species of small rodents, who could burrow and nest build to their heart's content in the ready-made mattress of moss. They did other things, too, and they must have done them with great frequency, for as June waned into July, the country seemed to become alive with little rodents. Red-backed mice and meadow mice began invading Mike's cabin in such numbers that it looked as if I would soon be starving, unless I could thwart their appetites for my supplies. When I awoke one morning to find that a meadow mouse had given birth to 11 naked offspring inside the pillow of my sleeping bag, I began to know how Pharaoh must have felt when he antagonized the God of the Israelites. I suppose it was only because my own wolf indoctrination had been so complete and of such a staggeringly inaccurate nature that it took me so long to account for the healthy state of the wolves in the apparent absence of any game worthy of their reputation. The idea of wolves not only eating but actually thriving and raising their families on a diet of mice was so at odds with the character of the mythical wolf that it was really too ludicrous to consider. Nevertheless, this was the answer to the problem of how my wolves were keeping the larder full. Angeline tipped me off. Late one afternoon, while the male wolves were still resting in preparation for the night's labors, she emerged from the den and nuzzled Uncle Albert until he yawned, stretched, and got laboriously to his feet. Then she left the den site at a trot, heading directly for me across a broad expanse of grassy muskeg, and leaving Albert to entertain the pups as best he could. There was nothing particularly new in this. I had several times seen her conscript Albert, and on rare occasions even George, to do duty as babysitter while she went down to the bay for a drink, or, as I had mistakenly thought, simply went for a walk to stretch her legs. Usually her peregrinations took her to the point of the bay farthest from my tent, where she was hidden from sight by a low gravel ridge, but this time she remained in full view, so I swung my telescope to keep an eye on her. She went directly to the rocky foreshore, waded out until the icy water was up to her shoulders, and had a long drink. As she was doing this, a small flock of old squaw ducks flew around the point of the bay and pitched only 100 yards or so away from her. She raised her head and eyed them speculatively for a moment, then waded back to shore, where she proceeded to act as if she had suddenly become demented. Yipping like a puppy, she began to chase her tail, to roll over and over amongst the rocks, to lie on her back, to wave all 4 feet furiously in the air, and in general to behave as if she was clean out of her mind. I swung the glasses back to where Albert was sitting amidst a gaggle of pups to see if he, too, had observed this mad display, and, if so, what his reaction to it was. He had seen it all right. In fact, he was watching Angeline with keen interest, but without the slightest indication of alarm. By this time, Angeline appeared to be in the throes of a manic paroxysm, leaping wildly into the air and snapping at nothing, the while uttering shrill squeals. It was an awe-inspiring sight, and I realized that Albert and I were not the only ones who were watching with fascination. The ducks seemed hypnotized by curiosity. So interested were they that they swam in for a closer view of this apparition on the shore. Closer and closer they came, necks outstretched and gabbling incredulously amongst themselves. And the closer they came, the crazier grew Angeline's behavior. When the leading duck was not more than 15 feet from shore, Angeline gave one gigantic leap toward it. There was a vast splash, a panic-stricken whacking of wings, then all the ducks were up and away. Angeline had missed a dinner, but by no more than inches. The incident was an eye-opener, since it suggested a versatility at food-getting which I would hardly have credited to a mere wolf. However, Angeline soon demonstrated that the charming of ducks was a mere sideline. Having dried herself with a series of energetic shakes which momentarily hid her in a blue mist of water droplets, she paddled back across the grassy swale. But now her movements were quite different from what they had been when she passed through the swale on the way to the bay. Angeline was of a rangy build anyway, but by stretching herself so that she literally seemed to be walking on tiptoe, and by elevating her neck like a camel, she seemed to gain several inches in height. She began to move infinitely slowly upwind across the swale, and I had the impression that both ears were cocked for the faintest sound, while I could see her nose wrinkling as she sifted the breeze for the most ephemeral scents. Suddenly she pounced. Flinging herself up on her hind legs, like a horse trying to throw its rider, she came down again with driving force, both forelegs held stiffly out in front of her. Instantly, her head dropped. She snapped once, swallowed, and returned to her peculiar mincing ballet across the swale. 6 times in 10 minutes she repeated the straight-armed pounce, and 6 times she swallowed, without my having caught a glimpse of what it was that she had eaten. The 7th time she missed her aim, spun around, and began snapping frenziedly in a tangle of cotton grass. This time, when she raised her head, I saw, quite unmistakably, the tail and hindquarters of a mouse quivering in her jaw. 1 gulp, and it too was gone. Although I was much entertained by the spectacle of one of this continent's most powerful carnivores hunting mice, I did not really take it seriously. I thought Angeline was only having fun, snacking, as it were. But when she had eaten some 23 mice, I began to wonder. Mice are small, but 23 of them adds up to a fair-sized meal, even for a wolf. It was only later, by putting 2 and 2 together, that I was able to bring myself to an acceptance of the obvious. The wolves of Wolf House Bay, and, by inference at least, all the barren land wolves who were raising families outside the summer caribou range, were living largely, if not almost entirely, on mice. Only one point remained obscure, and that was how they transported the catch of mice, which, in the course of an entire night, must have amounted to a formidable number of individuals, back to the dens to feed the pups. I never did solve this problem until I met some of Mike's relations. One of them, a charming fellow named Utek, who was a first-rate, if untrained, naturalist, explained the mystery. Since it was impossible for the wolves to carry the mice home externally, they did the next best thing and brought them home in their bellies. I had already noticed that when either George or Albert returned from a hunt, they went straight to the den and crawled into it. Though I did not suspect it at the time, they were regurgitating the day's rations, already partially digested. The realization that the wolves' summer diet consisted chiefly of mice did not conclude my work in the field of dietetics. I knew that the mouse-wolf relationship was a revolutionary one to science and would be treated with suspicion and possibly with ridicule, unless it could be so thoroughly substantiated that there would be no room to doubt its validity. I had already established two major points. One, that wolves caught and ate mice. Two, that the small rodents were sufficiently numerous to support a wolf population. There remained, however, a third point, vital to the proof of my contention. This concerned the nutritional value of mice. It was imperative for me to prove that a diet of small rodents would suffice to maintain a large carnivore in good condition. I recognized that this was not going to be an easy task. Only a controlled experiment would do, and since I could not exert the necessary control over the wolves, I was at a loss how to proceed. For some days I pondered the problem, and then, one morning, while I was preparing some lemmings and meadow mice as specimens, inspiration struck me. Despite the fact that man is not wholly carnivorous, there was no valid reason why I should not use myself as a test subject. There being no time like the present, I resolved to begin the experiment at once. The taste of the mice, a purely subjective factor, and not in the least relevant to the experiment, was pleasing, if rather bland. As the experiment progressed, this blandness led to a certain degree of boredom and a consequent loss of appetite, and I was forced to seek variety in my methods of preparation. Of the several recipes which I developed, the finest by far was creamed mice, or souris à la crème. During the first weeks of the mouse diet, I found that my vigor remained unimpaired and that I suffered no apparent ill effects. It was during the final stages of my mouse-eating experiment that Mike returned to his cabin. He brought with him his cousin Utek, who was to become my boon companion and to prove invaluable in my wolf researches. However, on my first encounter with Utek, I found him almost as reserved and difficult of approach as Mike. I had made a trip back to the cabin to fetch some additional supplies, and the sight of smoke rising from the chimney cheered me greatly, for, to tell the truth, there had been times when I would have enjoyed a little human companionship. When I entered the cabin, Mike was frying a panful of venison steak while Utek looked on. They had been lucky enough to kill a stray animal some 60 miles to the north. After a somewhat awkward few minutes, during which Mike seemed to be hopefully trying to ignore my existence, I managed to break the ice and achieve an introduction to Utek, who responded by sliding around to the other side of the table, thereby putting as much distance between us as possible. These two then sat down to their dinner, and Mike eventually offered me a plate of fried steak too. Frankly, I would have enjoyed eating it, but I was still conducting my experiment, and so I had to refuse, after having first explained my reasons to Mike. He accepted my excuses with the inscrutable silence of his Eskimo ancestors. Though I never did manage to make Mike understand the importance and nature of my scientific work, I had no such difficulty with Utek. Or rather, perhaps I should say that though he may not have understood it, he seemed from the first to share my conviction that it was important. Much later, I discovered that Utek was a minor shaman in his own tribe, and he had assumed, from the tales told him by Mike and from what he had seen with his own eyes, that I must be a shaman too, if of a somewhat unfamiliar variety. From his point of view, this assumption provided an adequate explanation for most of my otherwise inexplicable activities, and it is just possible, though I hesitate to attribute any such selfish motives to Utek, that by associating with me, he hoped to enlarge his own knowledge of the esoteric practices of his vocation. In any event, Utek decided to attach himself to me, and the very next day he appeared at the wolf observation tent, bringing with him his sleeping robes, and obviously prepared for a long visit. My fears that he would prove to be an encumbrance and a nuisance were soon dispelled. Utek had been taught a few words of English by Mike, and his perceptivity was so excellent that we were soon able to establish rudimentary communication. He showed no surprise when he understood that I was devoting my time to studying wolves. In fact, he conveyed to me the information that he too was keenly interested in wolves, partly because his own personal totem, or helping spirit, was Amarok, the wolf being. Utek had none of the misconceptions about wolves which, taken en masse, comprise the body of accepted writ in our society. In fact, he was so close to the beasts that he considered them his actual relations. Later, when I had learned some of his language and he had improved in his knowledge of mine, he told me that as a child of about 5 years, he had been taken to a wolf den by his father, a shaman of repute, and had been left there for 24 hours. During this time, he had made friends with and played on terms of equality with the wolf pups, and was sniffed at, but otherwise unmolested by the adult wolves. It would have been unscientific for me to have accepted all the things he told me about wolves without auxiliary proof, but I found that when such proof was obtainable, he was invariably right. Utek's acceptance of me had an ameliorating effect upon Mike's attitude. Although Mike continued to harbor a deep-rooted suspicion that I was not quite right in the head and might yet prove dangerous unless closely watched, he loosened up as much as his taciturn nature would permit and tried to be cooperative. This was a great boon to me, for I was able to enlist his aid as an interpreter between Utek and myself. Utek had a great deal to add to my knowledge of wolves' food habits. Having confirmed what I had already discovered about the role mice played in their diet, he told me that wolves also ate great numbers of ground squirrels, and at times even seemed to prefer them to caribou. These ground squirrels are abundant throughout most of the Arctic. They are close relatives of the common gopher of the western plains, but unlike the gopher, they have a very poor sense of self-preservation. Consequently, they fall easy prey to wolves and foxes. In summer, when they are well fed and fat, they may weigh as much as 2 pounds, so that a wolf can often kill enough of them to make a good meal with only a fraction of the energy expenditure involved in hunting caribou. I had assumed that fishes could hardly enter into the wolf's diet, but Utek assured me I was wrong. He told me he had several times watched wolves fishing for jackfish or northern pike. At spawning time in the spring, these big fish, which sometimes weigh as much as 40 pounds, invade the intricate network of narrow channels in boggy marshes along the lake shores. When a wolf decides to go after them, he jumps into one of the larger channels and wades upstream, splashing mightily as he goes, and driving the pike ahead of him into progressively narrower and shallower channels. Eventually, the fish realizes its danger and turns to make a dash for open water, but the wolf stands in its way, and one quick chop of those great jaws is enough to break the back of even the largest pike. Utek told me he once watched a wolf catch 7 large pike in less than an hour. These sidelights on the lupine character were fascinating, but it was when we came to a discussion of the role played by caribou in the life of the wolf that Utek really opened my eyes. The wolf and the caribou were so closely linked, he told me, that they were almost a single entity. He explained what he meant by telling me a story which sounded a little like something out of the Old Testament, but which, so Mike confirmed, was a part of the semi-religious folklore of the inland Eskimos, who, alas for their immortal souls, were still happily heathen. Here, paraphrased, is Utek's tale. In the beginning there was a woman and a man, and nothing else walked or swam or flew in the world, until one day the woman dug a great hole in the ground and began fishing in it. One by one she pulled out all the animals, and the last one she pulled out of the hole was the caribou. Then Kaila, the god of the sky, told the woman the caribou was the greatest gift of all, for the caribou would be the sustenance of man. The woman set the caribou free and ordered it to go out over the land and multiply. And the caribou did as the woman said, and in time the land was filled with caribou. So the sons of the woman hunted well, and they were fed and clothed and had good skin tents to live in, all from the caribou. The sons of the woman hunted only the big fat caribou, for they had no wish to kill the weak and the small and the sick, since these were no good to eat, nor were their skins much good. And after a time it happened that the sick and the weak came to outnumber the fat and the strong. And when the sons saw this, they were dismayed, and they complained to the woman. Then the woman made magic and spoke to Kaila and said, "Your work is no good, for the caribou grow weak and sick, and if we eat them, we must grow weak and sick also." Kaila heard, and he said, "My work is good. I shall tell Amarok, the spirit of the wolf, and he shall tell his children, and they will eat the sick and the weak and the small caribou, so that the land will be left for the fat and the good ones." And this is what happened, and this is why the caribou and the wolf are one. For the caribou feeds the wolf, but it is the wolf who keeps the caribou strong. I was slightly stunned by this story, for I was not prepared to have an unlettered and untutored Eskimo give me a lecture, even in parable form, illustrating the theory of survival of the fittest through the agency of natural selection. In any event, I was skeptical about the happy relationship which Utek postulated as existing between caribou and wolf. Although I had already been disabused of the truth of a good many scientifically established beliefs about wolves by my own recent experiences, I could hardly believe that the all-powerful and intelligent wolf would limit his predation on the caribou herds to culling the sick and the infirm, when he could, presumably, take his choice of the fattest and most succulent individuals. Furthermore, I had what I thought was excellent ammunition with which to demolish Utek's thesis. "Ask him, then," I told Mike, "how come there are so many skeletons of big and evidently healthy caribou scattered around the cabin and all over the tundra for miles to the north of here?" "Don't need to ask him that," Mike replied with unabashed candor. "It was me killed those deer. I got 14 dogs to feed, and it takes maybe 2-3 caribou a week for that. I got to feed myself too, and then I got to kill lots of deer everywhere all over the trapping country. I set 4 or 5 traps around each deer like that and get plenty foxes when they come to feed. It's no use for me to shoot skinny caribou. What I got to have is the big fat ones." "How many do you think you kill in a year?" I asked. Mike grinned proudly. "I'm pretty damn good shot. Kill maybe 200-300, maybe more." When I had partially recovered from that one, I asked him if this was the usual thing for trappers. "Every trapper got to do the same. Indians, white men, all the way down south as far as caribou go in the wintertime. They got to kill lots of them or they can't trap no good. Of course, they not all the time lucky to get enough caribou. Then they got to feed the dogs on fish. But dogs can't work good on fish, get weak and sick, and can't haul no loads. Caribou is better." I knew, from having studied the files at Ottawa, that there were 1,800 trappers in those portions of Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and southern Keewatin, which comprised the winter range of the Keewatin caribou herd. I also knew that many of these trappers had been polled by Ottawa through the agency of the fur trading companies for information which might help explain the rapid decline in the size of the Keewatin caribou herd. I had read the results of this poll. To a man, the trappers and traders denied that they killed more than 1 or 2 caribou a year, and to a man they had insisted that wolves slaughtered the deer in untold thousands. Although mathematics had never been my strong point, I tried to work out some totals from the information at hand. Being a naturally conservative fellow, I cut the number of trappers in half, and then cut Mike's annual caribou kill in half before multiplying the two. No matter how many times I multiplied, I kept coming up with the fantastic figure of 112,000 animals killed by trappers in this area every year. I realized it was not a figure I could use in my official reports, not unless I wished to be posted to the Galapagos Islands to conduct a 10-year study on tortoise ticks. In any event, what Mike and Utek had told me was largely hearsay evidence, and this was not what I was employed to gather. Resolutely, I put these disturbing revelations out of mind and went back to learning the truth the hard way. Utek had many singular attributes as a naturalist, not the least of which was his apparent ability to understand wolf language. Before I met Utek, I had already noted that the variety and range of the vocal noises made by George, Angeline, and Uncle Albert far surpassed the ability of any other animals I knew about, save man alone. But my real education in lupine linguistics began a few days after Utek's arrival. The two of us had been observing the wolf den for several hours without seeing anything of note. It was a dead calm day, so that the flies had reached plague proportions, and Angeline and the pups had retired to the den to escape, while both males, exhausted after a hunt which had lasted into mid-morning, were sleeping nearby. I was getting bored and sleepy myself when Utek suddenly cupped his hand to his ears and began to listen intently. I could hear nothing, and I had no idea what had caught his attention until he said, "Listen, the wolves are talking," and pointed toward a range of hills some 5 miles to the north of us. I listened, but if a wolf was broadcasting from those hills, he was not on my wavelength. I heard nothing except the baleful buzzing of mosquitoes. But George, who had been sleeping on the crest of the esker, suddenly sat up, cocked his ears forward, and pointed his long muzzle toward the north. After a minute or two, he threw back his head and howled, a long, quavering howl, which started low and ended in the highest note my ears would register. Utek grabbed my arm and broke into a delighted grin. "Caribou are coming. The wolf says so." I got the gist of this, but not much more than the gist, and it was not until we returned to the cabin and I again had Mike's services as an interpreter that I learned the full story. According to Utek, a wolf living in the next territory to the north had not only informed our wolves that the long-awaited caribou had started to move south, but had even indicated where they were at the moment. To make the story even more improbable, this wolf had not actually seen the caribou himself, but had simply been passing on a report received from a still more distant wolf. George, having heard and understood, had then passed on the good news in his turn. I am incredulous by nature and by training, and I made no secret of my amusement at the naivety of Utek's attempt to impress me with this fantastic yarn. But if I was incredulous, Mike was not. Without more ado, he began packing up for a hunting trip. I was not surprised at his anxiety to kill a deer, for I had learned one truth by now, that he, as well as every other human being on the Barrens, was a meat-eater who lived almost exclusively on caribou when they were available. But I was amazed that he should be willing to make a 2 or 3 day hike over the tundra on evidence as wild as that which Utek offered. I said as much, but Mike went taciturn and left without another word. 3 days later, when I saw him again, he offered me a haunch of venison and a pot of caribou tongues. He also told me he had found the caribou where Utek, interpreting the wolf message, had said they would be, on the shores of a lake called Kuiak, some 40 miles northeast of the cabin. I knew this had to be coincidence. But being curious as to how far Mike would go to pull my leg, I feigned conversion and asked him to tell me more about Utek's uncanny skill. Mike obliged. He explained that the wolves not only possessed the ability to communicate over great distances, but, so he insisted, could talk. He admitted that he himself could neither hear all the sounds they made nor understand most of them. But he said some Eskimos, and Utek in particular, could hear and understand so well that they could quite literally converse with wolves. I mulled this information over for a while and concluded that anything this pair told me from then on would have to be recorded with a heavy sprinkling of question marks. However, the niggling idea kept recurring that there just might be something in it. So I asked Mike to tell Utek to keep track of what our wolves said in future, and, through Mike, to keep me informed. The next morning, when we arrived at the den, there was no sign of either of the male wolves. Angeline seemed ill at ease. She kept making short trips to the crest of the den ridge, where she stood in a listening attitude for a few minutes before returning to the pups. Time passed, and George and Uncle Albert were considerably overdue. Then, on her 5th trip to the ridge, Angeline appeared to hear something. So did Utek. Once more, he went through his theatrical performance of cupping both ears. After listening a moment, he proceeded to try and give me an explanation of what was going on. Alas, we were not yet sufficiently en rapport, and this time I did not even get the gist of what he was saying. I went back to my observing routine while Utek crawled into the tent for a sleep. I noted in my log that George and Uncle Albert arrived back at the den together, obviously exhausted, at 12:17 p.m. About 2 p.m., Utek woke up and made amends for his dereliction of duty by brewing me a pot of tea. The next time we encountered Mike, I recalled him to his promise, and he began to interrogate Utek. Yesterday, Mike told me, Utek says that wolf you call George, he send a message to his wife. Utek hear it good. He tell his wife the hunting is pretty bad and he going to stay out longer, maybe not get home until middle of the day. I remembered that Utek could not have known at what time the male wolves returned home, for he was then fast asleep inside the tent. And 12:17 is close enough to the middle of the day for any practical purpose. Nevertheless, for 2 more days my skepticism ruled, until the afternoon, when once again George appeared on the crest and cocked his ears toward the north. Whatever he heard, if he heard anything, did not seem to interest him much this time, for he did not howl, but went off to the den to sniff noses with Angeline. Utek, on the other hand, was definitely interested. Excitement filled his face. He fairly gabbled at me, but I caught only a few words. Inuit, Eskimos, and kaye, come, were repeated several times as he tried passionately to make me understand. When I still looked dense, he gave me an exasperated glance, and without so much as a by your leave, headed off across the tundra in a direction to the northwest of Mike's cabin. I was a little annoyed by his cavalier departure, but I soon forgot about it, for it was now late afternoon, and all the wolves were becoming restless as the time approached for the males to set off on the evening hunt. There was a definite ritual about these preparations. George usually began them by making a visit to the den. If Angeline and the pups were inside, his visit brought them out. If they were already outside, Angeline's behavior changed from that of domestic boredom to one of excitement. She would begin to romp, leaping in front of George, charging him with her shoulder, and embracing him with her forelegs. George seemed at his most amiable during these playful moments, and would sometimes respond by engaging in a mock battle with his mate. From where I sat, these battles looked rather ferocious, but the steadily wagging tails of both wolves showed it was all well meant. No doubt alerted by the sounds of play, Uncle Albert would appear on the scene and join the group. He often chose to sleep away the daylight hours some distance from the den side, perhaps in order to reduce the possibility of being dragooned into the role of babysitter at too frequent intervals. With his arrival, all 3 adult wolves would stand in a circle, sniff noses, wag their tails hard, and make noises. Now, make noises is not very descriptive, but it is the best I can do. I was too far off to hear more than the louder sounds, and these appeared to be more like grunts than anything else. Their meaning was obscure to me, but they were certainly connected with a general feeling of goodwill, anticipation, and high spirits. After anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour of conviviality, in which the pups took part, getting under everyone's feet and nipping at any adult tail they might encounter, the 3 adults would adjourn to the crest of the den, usually led by Angeline. Once more they would form a circle, and then, lifting their heads high, would sing for a few minutes. This was one of the high points of their day, and it was certainly the high point of mine. The first few times the 3 wolves sang, the old ingrained fear set my back hairs tingling, and I cannot claim to having really enjoyed the chorus. However, with the passage of time, I not only came to enjoy it, but to anticipate it with acute pleasure. And yet I find it almost impossible to describe, for the only terms at my disposal are those relating to human music, and these are inadequate, if not actually misleading. The best I can do is to say that this full-throated and great-hearted chorus moved me as I have very occasionally been moved by the bowel-shaking throb and thunder of a superb organ played by a man who had transcended his mere manhood. The Impassionata never lasted long enough for me. In 3 or 4 minutes it would come to an end and the circle would break up. Once more, with much tail-wagging, nose-sniffing, and general evidence of goodwill and high content. Then, reluctantly, Angeline would move toward the den, often looking back to watch as George and Albert trotted off along one of the hunting trails. She made it clear that she wished desperately to join them, but in the end she would rejoin the pups instead, and once more submit to their ebullient demands, either for dinner or for play. On this particular night, the male wolves made a break from their usual routine. Instead of taking one of the trails leading north or northwest, they headed off toward the east, in the opposite direction from Mike's cabin. I thought no more about this variation until some time later, when a human shout made me turn around. Utek had returned, and he was not alone. With him were 3 bashful friends, all grinning and all shy at this first meeting with the strange Kablunuk who was interested in wolves. The arrival of such a mob made further observations that night likely to be unproductive, so I joined the 4 Eskimos in the trek back to the cabin. Mike was home and greeted the new visitors as old friends. Eventually I found a chance to ask him a few questions. Yes, he told me, Utek had indeed known that these men were on their way and would soon arrive. How had he known? A foolish question. He knew because he had heard the wolves on the 5-mile hills reporting the passage of the Eskimos through their territory. He had tried to tell me about it, but then, when I failed to understand, had felt obliged to leave me in order to intercept and greet his friends. And that was that. During the 3rd week in June, Angeline began to show increasing signs of restlessness. She gave the distinct impression that her too domestic life at the den was beginning to pall. When George and Albert departed of an evening for the hunt, she took to accompanying them on the first part of their journey. At first she went no further than 100 yards from the den, but on one occasion she covered a quarter of a mile before slowly returning home. George was clearly delighted with her changing mood. He had been trying for weeks to persuade her to join him on the night-long ranging across the tundra. On one occasion he had delayed his departure by a good hour, long after Albert had grown impatient and struck off on his own, in an attempt to entice his mate into going along. During that hour, he made 8 trips from the lookout ridge down to the nursery knoll where Angeline was lying in the midst of her pups. Each time he sniffed her fondly, wagged his tail furiously, and then started hopefully off toward the hunting trail. And each time, when she failed to follow, he returned to the lookout knoll to sit disconsolately for a few minutes before trying again. When he finally did depart, alone, he was the picture of disappointment and dejection, with head and tail both held so low that he seemed to slink away. The desire to have a night out together was clearly mutual, but the welfare of the pups remained paramount with Angeline, even though they seemed large enough and able enough to need far less attention. On the evening of June 23rd, I was alone at the tent, Utek having gone off on some business of his own for a few days, when the wolves gathered for their pre-hunt ritual sing-song. Angeline surpassed herself on this occasion, lifting her voice in such an untrammeled hymn of longing that I wished there was some way I could volunteer to look after the kids while she went off with George. I need not have bothered. Uncle Albert got the message. Or perhaps he had received more direct communications, for when the song was done, Angeline and George trotted buoyantly off together, while Albert mooched morosely down to the den and settled himself in for an all-night siege of pups. A few hours later, a driving rain began, and I had to give up my observations. There were no wolves in sight the next morning when the rain ceased, the mist lifted, and I could again begin observing. But shortly before 9 o'clock, George and Uncle Albert appeared on the crest of the esker. Both seemed nervous, or at least uneasy. After a good deal of restless pacing, nose sniffing, and short periods of immobility, during which they stared intently over the surrounding landscape, they split up. George took himself off to the highest point of the esker, where he sat down in full view and began to scan the country to the east and south. Uncle Albert trotted off along the ridge to the north and lay down on a rocky knoll, staring out over the western plains. There was still no sign of Angeline, and this, together with the unusual actions of the male wolves, began to make me uneasy too. The thought that something might have happened to Angeline struck me with surprising pain. I had not realized how fond I was becoming of her, but now that she appeared to be missing, I began to worry about her in dead earnest. I was on the point of leaving my tent and climbing the ridge to have a look for myself when she forestalled me. As I took a last quick glance through the telescope, I saw her emerge from the den with something in her mouth and start briskly across the face of the esker. For a moment I could not make out what it was she was carrying. Then, with a start of surprise, I recognized it as one of the pups. Making good time despite her burden, and the pup must have weighed 10 or 15 pounds, she trotted diagonally up the esker slope and disappeared into a small stand of spruce. 15 minutes later, she was back at the den for another pup, and by 10 o'clock she had moved the last of them. After she disappeared for the final time, both male wolves ceased their vigils and followed her, leaving me to stare bleakly over an empty landscape. I was greatly perturbed. The only explanation which I could think of for this mass exodus was that I had somehow disturbed the wolves so seriously they had felt impelled to abandon their den. If this was indeed the case, I knew I would only make matters worse by trying to follow them. Not being able to think of anything else to do, I hurried back to the cabin to consult Utek. The Eskimo immediately set my fears at rest. He explained that this shifting of the pups was a normal occurrence with every wolf family at about this time of year. There were several reasons for it, so he told me. In the first place, the pups had now been weaned, and since there was no water supply near the den, it was necessary to move them to a location where they could slack their thirst elsewhere than at their mother's teats. Secondly, the pups were growing too big for the den, which now could barely contain them all. Thirdly, and perhaps most important, it was time for the youngsters to give up babyhood and begin their education. They are too old to live in hole in the ground, but still too young to follow their parents, Mike interpreted as Utek explained. So the old wolves take them to a new place where there is room for pups to move around and to learn about the world, but where they are still safe. As it happened, both Utek and Mike were familiar with the location of the new summer den, as I called it, and the next day we moved the observation tent to a position partly overlooking it. The pups' new home, half a mile from the old den, was a narrow, truncated ravine filled with gigantic boulders which had been split off the cliff walls by frost action. A small stream ran through it. It also embraced an area of grassy marsh which was alive with meadow mice, an ideal place for the pups to learn the first principles of hunting. Exit to and entry from the ravine involved such a stiff climb that the youngsters could be left in their new home with little danger of their straying. And since they were now big enough to hold their own with the only other local carnivores of any stature, foxes and hawks, they had nothing to fear. That evening, Utek added several new items to my fund of information. Among other interesting things, he told me that wolves were longer lived than dogs. He had personally known several wolves who were at least 16 years old, while one wolf patriarch who lived near the Kazan River and who had been well known to Utek's father must have been over 20 years old before he disappeared. He also told me that wolves have the same general outlook toward pups that Eskimos have toward children, which is to say that actual paternity does not count for much, and therefore there are no orphans, as we use the term. Some years earlier, a wolf bitch who was raising her family only a mile or two from the camp where Utek was then living was shot and killed by a white man who was passing through the country by canoe. Utek, who considered himself to be magically related to all wolves, was very upset by the incident. There was a husky bitch with pups in the Eskimo camp at the time, and so he determined to dig out the wolf pups and put them with the bitch. However, his father deterred him by telling him it would not be necessary, that the wolves would solve the problem in their own way. Although his father was a great shaman and could be relied upon to speak the truth, Utek was not wholly convinced, and so he took up his own vigil over the den. He had not been in hiding many hours, so he told me, when he saw a strange wolf appear in company with the widowed male, and both wolves entered the den. When they came out, each was carrying a pup. Utek followed them for several miles until he realized they were heading for a second wolf den, the location of which was also known to him. By running hard and by taking shortcuts, he reached this second den before the two wolves did, and was present when they arrived. As soon as they appeared, the female who owned the den and who had a litter of her own came to the den mouth, seized the two pups one after another by the scruff of their necks, and took them into the den. The two males then departed to fetch another pair of pups. When the move was completed, there were 10 pups at this second den, all much of a size and age, and, as far as Utek could tell, all treated with identical care and kindness by the several adults, now including the bereaved male. This was a touching story, but I am afraid I did not give it due credence until some years later, when I heard of an almost identical case of adoption of motherless wolf pups. On this occasion, my informant was a white naturalist of such repute that I could hardly doubt his word, though, come to think of it, I am hard put to explain just why his word should have any more weight than Utek's, who was, after all, spiritually almost a wolf himself. Since the removal of the pups to the ravine, they had been largely hidden from my view, and so one morning before Angeline or the two males had returned from the nightly hunt, I made my way to an outcropping of rocks crowned with a scrub of dwarf spruce which overlooked the ravine from a distance of less than 100 feet. There was only the faintest puff of wind, and it was blowing from the northeast, so that any wolves at the den or approaching it would not be likely to get my scent. I settled myself amongst the spruces and scanned the floor of the ravine. The entire area, about 30 yards long by 10 wide, was crisscrossed with trails. As I watched, two pups emerged from a jumble of shattered rocks under one wall of the ravine and scampered down one of the trails toward the tiny stream. They drew up alongside each other at the stream's edge and plunged their blunt little faces into the water, wagging their stubby tails the while. They had grown a good deal in the past weeks and were now about the size of and roughly the same shape as fully grown groundhogs. They were so fat their legs seemed dwarfed, and their woolly gray coats of puppy hair made them look even more rotund. I could see no promise in them of the lithe and magnificent physique which characterized their parents. A third pup emerged into view a little farther down the gully, dragging with him the well-chewed scapula of a caribou. He was growling over it as if it were alive and dangerous, and the pups by the stream heard him, lifted their dripping faces, and then bounced off in his direction. A free-for-all now developed, and the air was filled with puppy growls and shrill yips of outrage as one or another of the little beasts sank his needle teeth into a brother's leg. The fourth pup appeared and flung himself into the melee with an ecstatic squeal of pleasure. After 4 or 5 minutes of this internecine warfare, a raven flew low over the gully, and as his shadow slipped past, the pups abandoned the bone and scuttled for shelter. But this was evidently only part of the game, for they emerged again at once, showing no sign of real fear. While 2 of them went back to battling over the bone, the other 2 ambled off to the muskeg patch and began sniffing about for mice. Any mice which still remained in this small area must have been exceptionally cagey. After a few minutes of perfunctory snuffling and 1 or 2 attempts to burrow into the muck, the pups gave up the attempt to hunt and started playing with each other. It was at this moment that Angeline returned. I was so engrossed in watching the pups that I was not aware of her presence until I heard a deep whine near at hand. The pups heard it too, and we all swiveled our heads to see Angeline at the edge of the ravine. The pups instantly abandoned their games and set up a shrill yammer of excitement, one of them even standing up on its pudgy hind legs and pawing the air in joyful anticipation. Angeline watched them for a second or two, poised and lovely, then leapt over the rim and down to the valley floor, where she was mobbed. She sniffed each pup, turning some of them right over on their backs in the process. Then she hunched her shoulders and began to retch. Although I should have known what to expect, I was caught off guard, and for a horrible moment was afraid she had eaten poison. Nothing of the kind. After several convulsive motions, she brought up what appeared to be at least 10 pounds of partly digested meat. Then she leapt out of the way and lay down to watch the pups go to it. If the morning meat delivery made me somewhat squeamish, it did not inhibit the pups. With single-minded voracity, they waded into their breakfast while Angeline watched them tolerantly, making no attempt to correct their appalling manners. Breakfast finished, and not a scrap remained for lunch, the pups simply keeled over where they stood, bloated and evidently incapable of any further hellery for the moment. The somnolence of a hot summer morning descended on us all. Very soon I was the only one still awake, and I was having a hard time staying that way. I would have liked to ease my position a little and have a stretch, but I didn't dare move, for I was so close to the wolves, and the silence was so complete that they would have heard the slightest sound I made. It may be indelicate of me to mention it, but I seem to have been equipped at birth with the equivalent of an echo chamber in my stomach. When I am hungry, or even sometimes when I'm not, this portion of my anatomy becomes autonomous and begins producing noises of a startling variety and volume, and of a carrying power which has to be heard to be believed. My demon drummer of the nether depths now chose to do his stuff, and the resultant cacophony rolled through the hush of the morning like distant thunder. Angeline woke with a start. Her head went up, and she listened intently, but with a puzzled expression. When the sounds continued, despite everything I could do to muffle them, she got slowly to her feet, and after a glance at the pups, as if to assure herself that they were not responsible, she cocked a speculative eye at the cloudless sky above. It held no solution to the mystery. Thoroughly aroused now, she began trying to track down the sounds. This was no easy task, for there is a pronounced ventriloquial effect to abdominal noises in general, and to mine in particular. After walking up and down the ravine twice, Angeline seemed no closer to satisfying her mounting curiosity. I was undecided whether to attempt a retreat or whether to stand my ground in the hopes that my internal orchestra would exhaust itself. But the orchestra showed that it was still full of vim and vigor by producing a new and protracted rumble of earth-shaking proportions. Moments later, Angeline's head appeared over the rim of the gully about 10 feet from me. We stared mutely into each other's eyes for several seconds. At least, she was mute. I was trying very hard to be, but with limited success. It was an extraordinarily embarrassing predicament. The more I had seen of Angeline, the higher my regard for her had risen. I valued her good opinion, and I did not want to appear foolish in her eyes. However, her sudden appearance seemed to stimulate my intestinal musicians to more splendid efforts, and before I could think of any feasible way of excusing myself, Angeline wrinkled her lips, bared her superb white teeth in an expression of cold disdain, and vanished. Hastily abandoning my hiding place, I ran after her to the edge of the ravine, but I arrived too late even to apologize. All I saw of her was a scornful flick of her beautiful tail as she disappeared into the warren of crevices on the far side of the gully, driving her pups before her. Although I continued my vigil at the observation tent well into July, I did not add much to my knowledge of the wolves. Because the pups were growing rapidly and needed increasingly large quantities of food, George, Angeline, and Albert were forced to devote most of their energy and time to hunting far afield. During the brief periods when they were at the den, they spent most of their time sleeping, since finding food for the pups had become an exhausting business. Nevertheless, they were still able to surprise me. Although Angeline now frequently went hunting with the males, there were nights when she did not go, and during one of these she had visitors. It was well after midnight, and I was dozing in my tent when a wolf howled from somewhere south of me, and not too far away. It was an unusual call, rather muted, and with no quavers. Sleepily, I picked up my binoculars and tried to locate the source. Eventually, I spotted 2 wolves, both strangers to me, sitting on a point of land on my side of the bay and directly opposite the wolf esker. This discovery brought me fully awake, for I had come to assume that the territory of each wolf family was sacrosanct as far as other wolves were concerned. I knew Angeline was at home, for I had seen her entering the gully a little while earlier, and I was intensely curious to see how she would react to this intrusion. When I trained my glasses on the gully, she had already emerged and was standing facing the point where the strangers were. She was keenly alert, head thrust forward, ears cocked, and her tail stretched out astern like that of a setter. None of the wolves moved or made a further sound for several minutes. Then one of the strangers again essayed the rather tentative howl which I had already heard. Angeline began slowly wagging her tail, and her tense attitude relaxed visibly. Then she trotted forward to the edge of the ravine and barked sharply. Now, I am aware that, according to the books, wolves, and husky dogs, are not supposed to bark. But Angeline's bark was a bark and nothing else, and as soon as they heard it, the two strange wolves got to their feet and began trotting purposefully around the shore of the bay. Angeline met them about a quarter of a mile from the den. Standing stock still, she waited for them to approach, and when they were 5 or 10 yards from her, they too stopped. I could hear nothing, but the tails of all three wolves began to wave slowly back and forth, and after a minute or so of this mutual indication of good feeling, Angeline stepped gingerly forward and sniffed noses. The strangers were evidently welcome. When the greeting ceremonies had been concluded, all three wolves trotted toward the summer den. At the edge of the ravine, one of the strangers began to romp with Angeline, and the two played for several minutes, although far more gently than Angeline normally played with George, or George with Albert. While this was going on, the second stranger calmly descended into the depths of the ravine where the 4 pups were. Unfortunately, I could not see what took place in the ravine itself, but it was certainly nothing to disturb Angeline, for, having finished playing with her friend, she also walked to the edge of the ravine and stood looking down, her tail wagging harder than ever. The strangers did not stay long. After 20 minutes, the one in the ravine re-emerged. There was further nose smelling amongst all three, and then the strangers turned away and set off back the way they had come. Angeline accompanied them for some distance, frolicking first with one and then the other. It was not until they swung away from the shore of the bay and headed west that she turned for home. When I told Utek of what I had seen, he was not at all surprised, but seemed to find my surprise rather inexplicable. After all, he pointed out, people visit other people, so what was so odd about wolves visiting other wolves? He had me there. At this juncture, Mike entered the discussion by asking me to describe the strange wolves. I did my best, and he nodded. "I guess they're the bunch in Hidden Valley," he said. "It's maybe 3, 4, 5 miles south of here. I see them many times. 2 bitches, 1 dog wolf, some pups. I guess one of them's the mother of the bitch you call Angeline. The other's Angeline's sister, maybe. Anyhow, in fall, they all join up with your bunch and go south together." I considered this information in silence for a few minutes, and then I asked, "Since only one of those 2 bitches has a mate, the other must still be a spinster. Which one would it be, do you think?" Mike gave me a long and thoughtful stare. "Listen," he said, "how soon you figure to leave this country and go home, eh? When wolf bitch begins to look good, you've been here too damn long." In mid-July, I decided it was time to give up my role as a static observer and begin studying the hunting activities of wolves. This decision was hastened by the accidental uncovering of my long-neglected operation order from under a pile of dirty socks which had been accumulating on top of it for several weeks. I had almost forgotten not only about the order, but about Ottawa itself. But as I again leafed through the minutely detailed sheaf of instructions, I realized I had been guilty of a dereliction of duty. The orders plainly stated that my first task should have been to conduct a census and general survey of wolves, followed by an intensive study of wolf-caribou predator-prey relationships. Studies of the nature and the social behavior of wolves were thus placed firmly outside the frame of reference of my work. So one morning I struck my little tent, packed up the telescope, and closed down my observation post. The following day, Utek and I loaded a camping outfit aboard the canoe and set out on a prolonged cruise through the tundra plains to the northward. We covered a good many hundreds of miles during the succeeding weeks and gathered much information concerning wolf population and wolf-caribou predator-prey relationships, together with a lot of associated information, which, though it was unrelated to the department's aims, could not be entirely ignored. A semi-official estimate of the wolf population of Keewatin had already been made by the competent authorities on the basis of information received from the usual trapper-trader sources, and the given figure was 30,000 wolves. Even with my sketchy grasp of mathematics, I was able to work this out as an average of 1 wolf to every 6 square miles. If one then took into account the fact that about a third of the tundra plains lay under water, while another third consisted of barren rock hills and ridges where neither caribou, wolf, nor most other beasts could make a living. The density rose to 1 wolf for every 2 square miles. This seemed pretty dense. Indeed, had it been true, Utek and I might have had trouble making progress due to the sheer pressure of wolves. Unhappily for the theoreticians, we found the wolves widely scattered in family groups occupying a territory of 1 to 300 square miles. Although this dispersal was by no means uniform. We located one site, for instance, where 2 families had denned within half a mile of each other. An Utek told me he had once found 3 females, each with a litter of pups, denning within a few feet of one another on an esker near the Kazan River. On the other hand, we traveled for 3 days through what looked like good wolf country on the Thluiaza River and never saw a footing, a scat, or a hair of a wolf. Reluctantly, and recognizing that it was not going to endear me to my employers, I was forced to revise the population estimate downward to 3,000 instead of 30, and at that I was probably guilty of gross exaggeration. The families we encountered were of all sizes, from a single pair of adults with 3 pups to a group of 7 adults with 10 pups. Since, in every case but one, there were extra adults, and since I could learn nothing about their relative status in the family except by murdering them, which would have enabled me only to determine age and sex, I again resorted to Utek for information. Female wolves do not breed until they are 2 years old, and males not until they are 3, he told me. Until they are of breeding age, most of the adolescents remain with their parents. But even when they are of age to start a family, they are often prevented from doing so by a shortage of homesteads. There is simply not enough hunting territory available to provide the wherewithal for every bitch to raise a litter. Since an overpopulation of wolves would mean a rapid decline in the numbers of prey animals, with consequent starvation for the wolves themselves, they are forced to practice what amounts to birth control through continence. Some adult wolves may have to remain celibate for years before a territory becomes available. However, because the period of urgent amorous appetite is short, only about 3 weeks out of the year, these bachelors and spinsters probably do not suffer any great feelings of sexual deprivation. Moreover, their desire for domesticity and the companionship of other adults, as well as pups, is apparently met by the communal nature of the family group. Indeed, Utek believed some wolves actually preferred the uncle or aunt status, since it gave them the pleasures of being involved in rearing a family without incurring the full responsibilities of parenthood. Old wolves, particularly those who have lost their mates, also tend to remain celibate. Utek told me of a wolf he had encountered every year for 16 years who, during the first 6 years of this period, fathered an annual litter. During the 7th winter, his mate disappeared, possibly poisoned by bounty hunters in the south. The following spring, he was back at his old den, but although a litter of pups was reared there that season, they belonged to another pair of wolves, perhaps, so Utek thought, to the widower's son and daughter-in-law. In any event, the old wolf remained supernumerary to the establishment for the rest of his life, although continuing to share in the task of providing for the pups. Apart from the fact that there are only a fixed number of homesteads or territories available to the wolves, their abundance is apparently further restricted by a built-in birth control mechanism. Thus it happens that when food species are abundant, or the wolf population is scanty, bitches give birth to large litters, sometimes as many as 8 pups. But if the wolves are too numerous or food is scarce, the number of pups in a litter may fall to as few as 1 or 2. Epidemic disease is the overriding factor which ensures that, even if other controlling factors fail to operate, the wolf population will not become too large for the capacity of the prey animals to maintain it. On those rare occasions when the general balance is upset, often as a result of man's interference, and wolves become too abundant, they begin to weaken physically as food grows scarce until malnutrition grades into outright starvation. At times such as these, devastating epidemics of rabies, distemper, or mange invariably appear amongst the wolves, and their numbers are quickly reduced to a bare survival level. Now, animals stricken with rabies do not go mad in the usual sense of the word. Their nervous systems are affected so that they become erratic and unpredictable, and they lose the protection of a sense of fear. Rabid wolves sometimes walk blindly into speeding automobiles and trains. They have come stumbling in among entire teams of huskies and have been torn to pieces as a result. And not infrequently, they have wandered into village streets and have even entered tents or houses occupied by men. Such wolves, sick to the verge of death, are pitiable objects, but the human reaction to them is usually one of unbridled terror, not of the disease, for it is seldom recognized as rabies, but of the wolves themselves. Grotesque incidents occur which help to sustain the general myth about the vicious and dangerous nature of the wolf. One such sick and dying wolf appeared in Churchill during an epidemic of rabies that took place in 1946. It was first encountered by a Canadian Army corporal wending his way back to barracks after a session at the Churchill Beer Hall. According to the corporal's account, a gigantic wolf leapt at him with murderous intent, and he barely escaped with his life by running a mile to the shelter of the guardhouse. He could exhibit no physical evidence of his ordeal, but his psychic scars were evidently deep. His warning sent the whole army camp into a panic of near-hysterical proportions. American and Canadian contingents alike were mobilized, and squads of grim-faced men armed with rifles, carbines, and spotlights were soon scouring the surrounding country, intent on dealing with a menace which, in a matter of hours, had grown into several packs of starving wolves. During the ensuing excitement, 11 husky dogs, 1 American PFC, and a Chippewayan Indian coming home late became casualties, not of the wolf, but of the vigilantes. For 2 days, children and women stayed indoors. Foot soldiers all but vanished from the army camp, and men on missions to distant buildings either went by jeep, well armed, or did not go at all. A wolf was glimpsed on the second day by a light army aircraft which had joined the hunt, and an intrepid detachment of mounted police sallied forth to deal with it. The animal turned out to be a cocker spaniel belonging to the Hudson's Bay Company. Not until the third day did the panic ease. Late that afternoon, the driver of a 6-ton army truck returning to the camp from the airport suddenly saw a bundle of fur on the road ahead of him. He jammed on the brakes, but was unable to stop in time, and the wolf, by then so sick it could no longer move, was mercifully killed. The aftermath was interesting. To this day, there are residents of Churchill, and no doubt also a number of soldiers scattered over the continent, who will, at the drop of a hat, describe the invasion of Churchill by wolves in 1946. They will tell you of desperate personal encounters, of women and children savaged, of dog teams torn to ribbons, and of an entire human community living in a state of siege. All that is lacking is the final dramatic description of the North American equivalent of a Russian troika fleeing across the frozen plains, inevitably to be overwhelmed by a wave of wolves, while the polar night resounds to the crunching sound of human bones being cracked by wolfish jaws. The weeks which Utek and I spent cruising the tundra plains were idyllic. The weather was generally good, and the sensation of freedom we derived from the limitless land was as invigorating as the wide-ranging life we led. When we found ourselves in the territory of a new wolf family, we would make camp and explore the surrounding plains for as long as was required in order to make the acquaintance of the group. We were never lonely, despite the immensity and solitude of the country, for the caribou were always with us. Together with their attendant flocks of herring gulls and ravens, they imparted a sense of animation to what might otherwise have seemed a stark enough landscape. This country belonged to the deer, the wolves, the birds, and the smaller beasts. We too were no more than casual and insignificant intruders. Man had never dominated the Barrens. Even the Eskimos, whose territory it had once been, had lived in harmony with it. Now these inland Eskimos had all but vanished. The little group of 40 souls to which Utek belonged was the last of the inland people, and they were all but swallowed up in this immensity of wilderness. We encountered other human beings only on a single occasion. One morning, shortly after starting on our journey, we rounded a bend in a river, and Utek suddenly raised his paddle and gave a shout. On the foreshore ahead of us was a squat skin tent. At the sound of Utek's cry, 2 men, a woman, and 3 half-grown boys piled out of the tent and ran to the water's edge to watch us approach. We landed, and Utek introduced me to one of the families of his tribe. All that afternoon we sat about, drinking tea, gossiping, laughing and singing, and eating mountains of boiled caribou meat. When we turned in for the night, Utek told me that the men of the family had pitched their camp at this spot so they could be in a position to intercept the caribou who crossed the river at a narrows a few miles farther downstream. Paddling one-man kayaks and armed with short stabbing spears, these men hoped to be able to kill enough fat animals at the crossing to last them through the winter. Utek was anxious to join in their hunt, and he hoped I would not mind remaining here for a few days so that he could help his friends. I had no objection, and the next morning the 3 Eskimo men departed, leaving me to bask in a magnificent August day. The fly season was over. It was hot and there was no wind. I decided to take advantage of the weather to have a swim and get some sun on my pallid skin, so I went off a few hundred yards from the Eskimo camp. Modesty is the last of the civilized vices which a man sheds in the wilds. Stripped, swam, and then climbed a nearby ridge and lay down to sunbathe. Wolf-like, I occasionally raised my head and glanced around me, and about noon I saw a group of wolves crossing the crest of the next ridge to the north. There were 3 of them, one white, but the other 2 were almost black, a rare color phase. All were adults, but one of the black ones was smaller and lighter than the rest, and was probably a female. I was in a quandary. My clothes lay by the shore some distance away, and I had only my rubber shoes and my binoculars with me on the ridge. If I went back for my clothes, I knew I might lose track of these wolves. But, I thought, who needed clothes on a day like this? The wolves had by now disappeared over the next crest, so I seized my binoculars and hared off in pursuit. The countryside was a maze of low ridges separated by small valleys carpeted with grassy swales where small groups of caribou slowly grazed their way southward. It was an ideal terrain for me, since I was able to keep watch from the crests while the wolves crossed each of these valleys in turn. When they dropped from view behind a ridge, I had only to sprint after them with no danger of being seen until I reached another elevated position from which I could watch them traverse the succeeding valley. Sweating with excitement and exertion, I breasted the first ridge to the north, expecting to see some frenzied action as the 3 wolves came suddenly down upon the unsuspecting caribou below. But I was disconcerted to find myself looking out over a completely peaceful scene. There were about 50 bucks in view, scattered in groups of 3 to 10 animals, and all were busy grazing. The wolves were sauntering across the valley as if they had no more interest in the deer than in the rocks. The caribou, for their part, seemed quite unaware of any threat. 3 familiar dogs crossing a farm pasture would have produced as much of a reaction in a herd of domestic cattle as the wolves did amongst these caribou. The scene was all wrong. Here was a band of wolves surrounded by numbers of deer, but although each species was obviously fully aware of the presence of the other, neither seemed perturbed or even greatly interested. Incredulously, I watched the 3 wolves trot by within 50 yards of a pair of young bucks who were lying down chewing their cuds. The bucks turned their heads to watch the wolves go by, but they did not rise to their feet, nor did their jaws stop working. Their disdain for the wolves seemed suicidal. The 2 wolves passed on between 2 small herds of grazing deer, ignoring them and being ignored in their turn. My bewilderment increased when, as the wolves swung up a slope and disappeared over the next crest, I jumped up to follow, and the 2 bucks, who had been so apathetic in the presence of the wolves, leapt to their feet, staring at me in wild-eyed astonishment. As I sprinted past them, they thrust their heads forward, snorted unbelievingly, then spun on their heels and went galloping off as if pursued by devils. It seemed completely unjust that they should have been so terrified of me while remaining so blasé about the wolves. However, I solaced myself with the thought that their panic might have resulted from unfamiliarity with the spectacle of a white man, slightly pink, and clad only in boots and binoculars, racing madly across the landscape. I nearly ran right into the wolves over the next crest. They had assembled in a little group on the forward slope and were having a social interlude with much nose-smelling and tail-wagging. I flung myself down behind some rocks and waited. After a few moments, the white wolves started off again and the others followed. They were in no hurry, and there was considerable individual meandering as they went down the slopes toward the valley floor, where scores of deer were grazing. Several times, one or another of the wolves stopped to smell a clump of moss, or detoured to one side to investigate something on his own. When they reached the valley, they were strung out in line abreast and about 100 feet apart, and in this formation they turned and trotted along the valley floor. Only those deer immediately in front of the wolves showed any particular reaction. When a wolf approached to within 50 or 60 yards, the deer would snort, rise on their hind feet, and then spring off to one side of the line of advance. After galloping a few yards, some of them swung around again to watch with mild interest as the wolf went past. But most returned to their grazing without giving the wolf another glance. Within the space of an hour, the wolves and I had covered 3 or 4 miles, and had passed within close range of perhaps 400 caribou. In every case, the reaction of the deer had been the same. No interest while the wolves remained at a reasonable distance, casual interest if the wolves came very close, and avoiding tactics only when a collision seemed imminent. There had been no stampeding and no panic. Up to this time, most of the deer we had encountered had been bucks. Now we began to meet numbers of does and fawns, and the behavior of the wolves underwent a change. One of them flushed a lone fawn from a hiding place in a willow clump. The fawn leapt into view not 20 feet ahead of the wolf, who paused to watch it for an instant, then raced off in hot pursuit. My heart began to thud with excitement as I anticipated seeing a kill at last. It was not to be. The wolf ran hard for 50 yards without gaining perceptibly on the fawn, then suddenly broke off the chase and trotted back to rejoin his fellows. I could hardly believe my eyes. That fawn should have been doomed, and it certainly would have been if even a tenth of the wolfish reputation was in fact deserved. Yet during the next hour, at least 12 separate rushes were made by all 3 wolves against single fawns, a doe with a fawn, or groups of does and fawns. And in every case, the chase was broken off almost before it was well begun. I was becoming somewhat exasperated. I had not run several miles across country and exhausted myself just to watch a pack of wolves playing the fool. When the wolves left the next valley and wandered over the far crest, I went charging after them with blood in my eye. I'm not sure what I had in mind. Possibly I may have intended to chase down a caribou fawn myself, just to show these incompetent beasts how it was done. In any event, I shot over the crest and straight into the middle of the band. They had probably halted for a breather, and I burst in amongst them like a bomb. The group exploded. Wolves went tearing off at top speed in all directions, ears back, tails stretched straight behind them. They ran scared, and as they fled through the dispersed caribou herds, the deer finally reacted, and the stampede of frightened animals which I had been expecting to witness all that afternoon became something of a reality. Only, and I realized the fact with some bitterness, it was not the wolves who had been responsible, it was I. I gave it up then and turned for home. I queried Utek about the apparently inexplicable behavior of the band of wolves I had pursued, and in his patient and kindly fashion he once more endeavored to put me straight. To begin with, he told me that a healthy adult caribou can outrun a wolf with ease, and even a 3-week-old fawn can outrun all but the swiftest wolf. The caribou are perfectly well aware of this, and therefore know they have little to fear from wolves in the normal course of events. The wolves are fully aware of it too, and, being highly intelligent, seldom attempt to run down a healthy caribou, knowing full well that this would be a senseless waste of effort. What the wolves did instead, according to Utek, was to adopt a technique of systematically testing the state of health and general condition of the deer, in an effort to find one which was not up to par. When caribou were abundant, this testing was accomplished by rushing each band, putting it to flight for just long enough to reveal the presence, or absence, of a sick, wounded, or otherwise inferior beast. If such a one was revealed, the wolves closed on it and attempted to make a kill. If there was no such beast in the herd, the wolves soon desisted from the chase and went off to test another group. When caribou were hard to find, different techniques were used. Several wolves, acting in concert, would sometimes drive a small herd of deer into an ambush where other wolves were waiting. Or, if caribou were very scarce, the wolves might use a relay system, whereby one wolf would drive the deer toward another, posted some distance away, who would then take up the chase in his turn. Techniques such as these decreased the caribou's natural advantages, but it was usually still the weakest, or at any rate, the least able deer, which fell victim to the pursuing wolves. "It is as I told you," Utek said. "The caribou feeds the wolf, but it is the wolf who keeps the caribou strong. We know that if it were not for the wolf, there would be no caribou at all, for they would die as weakness spread amongst them." Utek also stressed the fact that, once a kill had been made, the wolves did no more hunting until the supply of food was completely gone, and they were forced by hunger to go back to work. These were novel concepts to one who had been taught to believe that wolves were not only capable of catching almost anything, but, actuated by an insatiable bloodlust, would slaughter everything which came within their range. Of the hunts I subsequently watched, almost all followed the pattern of the first one I had seen. The hunters, numbering from 1 to as many as 8 individual wolves, would be observed trotting unhurriedly through the dispersed groups of deer, who almost invariably seemed quite unconcerned by the presence of their mortal enemies. Every now and again a wolf, or sometimes 2 or 3, would turn aside from the line of march and make a short dash at some nearby deer, who would wait until the attackers were about 100 yards distant before throwing up their heads and galloping off disdainfully. The wolves would stop and watch the deer go. If the deer ran well and were obviously in good fettle, the wolves would turn away. This testing was not haphazard, and I began to see a pattern of selection emerging. It was very seldom indeed that wolves bothered testing the herds of prime bucks, who were then at the peak of condition, having done nothing all summer but eat and sleep. It was not that these bucks were dangerous adversaries, their great spreads of antlers are useless as weapons, but simply that the wolves did not stand a chance of closing with them, and they knew it. Mixed herds of does with fawns were much more interesting to the wolves, for the percentage of injured, malformed, or inferior individuals is naturally higher amongst fawns, who have not yet been subjected to any prolonged period of rigorous natural selection. Groups of aged and sterile does were also a favorite target for testing. Sometimes one of these old and weakened beasts would be concealed in the midst of a herd of prime and vigorous animals, but the wolves, who must have known the caribou almost as intimately as they knew themselves, would invariably spot such a beast and test what looked to my eyes like a hopelessly healthy and active herd. Fawns were often tested more severely than adults, and a wolf might chase a fawn for 200 or 300 yards. But unless the young animal showed signs of weakness or exhaustion within that distance, the chase was usually abandoned. Economy of effort seemed to be a guiding principle with the wolves, and an eminently sensible one too, for the testing process often had to be continued for many hours before the wolves encountered a caribou sufficiently infirm to be captured. When the testing finally produced such a beast, the hunt would take a new turn. The attacking wolf would recklessly expend the energy he had been conserving during the long search, and would go for his prey in a glorious surge of speed and power, which, if he was lucky, would bring him close behind the fleeing deer. Panic-stricken at last, the deer would begin frantically zigzagging. A foolish thing to do, I thought, since this enabled the wolf to take shortcuts and close the gap more quickly. Contrary to one more tenet of the wolf myth, I never saw a wolf attempt to hamstring a deer. Drawing upon all his strength, the wolf would forge up alongside the caribou and leap for its shoulder. The impact was usually enough to send the deer off balance, and before it could recover, the wolf would seize it by the back of the neck and bring it down, taking care to avoid the wildly thrashing hoofs, a blow from any one of which could cave in the wolf's rib cage like so much brittle candy. The kill was quickly and usually cleanly made, and I doubt very much if the deer suffered any more than a hog suffers when it is being butchered for human consumption. The wolf never kills for fun, which is probably one of the main differences distinguishing him from man. It is hard work for a wolf to catch and kill a big game animal. He may hunt all night and cover 50 or 60 miles of country before he is successful, if he is successful. This is his business, his job. And once he has obtained enough meat for his own and his family's needs, he prefers to spend the rest of his time resting, being sociable, or playing. Contrary to yet another misconception, I know of no valid evidence that wolves kill more than they can use, even when the rare opportunity to do so arises. A kill made during the denning season is revisited time and again until the last ounce of meat has been stripped from it. Often, if gulls, ravens, foxes, and other scavengers are numerous, the wolf will dismember the carcass and bury sections of it at considerable distances from the site of the kill in order to preserve it for his own use. Later in the season, when the united family is freely roaming its territory, the band will camp near each kill until it is completely consumed. Of 67 wolf-killed caribou, which I examined after the wolves were finished with them, few consisted of anything except bones, ligaments, hair, and offal. In most cases, even the long bones had been cracked for the marrow content, and in some cases the skull had been gnawed open, a formidable task even for a wolf. Another point of interest is that what little remained of most of these carcasses showed evidence of disease or serious debility. Bone deformations, particularly those caused by necrosis of the skull, were common, and the worn state of the teeth of many skulls showed that these belonged to old and enfeebled animals. Fresh kills, for the whole carcass was available for examination, were hard to come by, but on a number of occasions I reached a deer almost as soon as the wolves had killed it, and, with inexcusable gall, shooed the wolves away. They went timidly enough, albeit unhappily. Several of these deer were so heavily infested with external and internal parasites that they were little better than walking menageries doomed to die soon in any case. As the weeks wore on toward summer's end, the validity of Utek's thesis became more and more obvious. The vital importance played by the wolf in preserving rather than in destroying the caribou seemed irrefutable to me, although I was by no means sure it would appear in the same light to my employers. The time was drawing near when I would have to leave Wolf House Bay, not because I wished to, but because the wolves would soon be departing to their wintering grounds. During late October, when winter begins to savage the bleak plains, the caribou turn their backs on the tundra and begin working their way down into the alien but sheltered world of forests. And where they go, the wolves must follow, for in winter there is nothing left upon the frozen plains for the wolves to eat. From early November until April, the wolves and caribou travel together through the taiga, the sparse borderline forests of stunted spruce and jack pine lying below timberline. In years when the snowshoe rabbits are abundant, the wolves prey heavily upon them. But always they stay close to the deer, since in time of famine, only the deer can save them. Each wolf family travels as a group. But it's not uncommon for 2 or 3 small groups to come together in a single band. There appears to be no fixed rule about this, and such a band can break up into its component parts again at any time. However, there are upper limits to the numbers in a given band. Winter hunting requires a close degree of cooperation between several wolves if the hunt is to be successful. But if there are too many wolves, they will not all get enough to eat from a given kill. A band of from 5 to 10 individuals seems to be about the ideal size. They do not appear to have fixed territories in winter. Each band hunts where and as it pleases, and when 2 strange bands meet, they have been observed to greet each other and then go their separate ways. A concentration of bands seldom occurs in any one area. How they manage to keep dispersed and thereby avoid the danger of too many wolves and too little food is not known. The Chippewayan Indians say it is done by means of urine messages which are left on every prominent point, rock, or tree around the lakes and along the well-used trails. The fact remains that, unless outright starvation sweeps the land, the nomadic winter wolf bands, moving at the whim of the equally nomadic caribou herds, somehow manage to avoid treading on one another's toes. For the barren land wolves, winter is the time of death. Once they have entered timber, they are exposed to a concentrated, highly skilled, and furious assault from men. Trappers cannot bear them, for wolves not only compete for caribou, but can wreak havoc with a trapline, springing the light traps used for foxes without getting caught themselves. Furthermore, most white trappers are afraid of wolves, some of them deathly afraid, and there is nothing like the whip of fear to lash men into a fury of destruction. The war against the wolves is kept at white heat by government fish and game agencies, many of which still offer wolf bounties. In times when the value of foxes and other furs is depressed, this bounty becomes in effect a subsidy paid to trappers and traders alike. Much is said and written about the number of deer reputedly slaughtered by wolves. Very little is said about the actual numbers of wolves slaughtered by men. In one case, a general falsehood is widely and officially disseminated. In the other, the truth seems to be suppressed. Yet one trapper, operating along the boundary between Manitoba and Keewatin, in the winter of the first year of my study, collected bounty on 118 wolves, of which 107 were young ones born the previous spring. According to law, he should have killed those wolves by trapping or shooting them. In fact, he did what everyone else was doing in the far north. With the covert permission of government, he spread strychnine so indiscriminately over an immense area that almost the entire population of foxes, wolverines, and many lesser flesh-eaters was wiped out. That did not matter, since foxes fetched no price that year. Wolves, on the other hand, were worth $20 each for bounty. Traps and poison are the commonest wolf killers, but other methods are in wide use as well. One is the airplane, a favorite of those civic-minded sportsmen who serve society by sacrificing their time and money to the destruction of vermin. The crew of a high-flying aircraft keeps watch for wolves in the open, preferably on the ice of a lake. When one is found, the aircraft is flown over him, and the beast is pursued so long and hard that he frequently collapses and sometimes dies even before a blast of buckshot strikes him. However, I know of one occasion when this method failed of its purpose. 2 men in their own light aircraft had flown out from a large city to help rid the world of wolves. During previous hunts, they had killed many, and the pilot had become adept at chasing the beast so closely that his skis would almost strike them. One day he came too close. The harassed wolf turned, leapt high into the air, and snapped at one of the skis. The wolf died in the ensuing crash, but so did the two men. The incident was described in an article in a widely distributed sportsman's magazine as an example of the cunning and dangerous nature of the wolf, and of the boundless courage of the men who matched themselves against him. This is, of course, a classic gambit. Whenever and wherever men have engaged in the mindless slaughter of animals, they have often attempted to justify their acts by attributing the most vicious or revolting qualities to those they would destroy. And the less reason there is for the slaughter, the greater the campaign of vilification. Anti-wolf feelings at Brochet, the northern Manitoba base for my winter studies, when I arrived there from Wolfhouse Bay, were strong and bitter. According to the local game warden, the local people had been used to killing 50,000 caribou each winter as recently as 2 decades past, whereas now they were lucky if they could kill a couple of thousand. Caribou were becoming scarce to the point of rarity, and wolves were unanimously held to be to blame. My rather meek remonstrance to the effect that wolves had been preying on caribou without decimating the herds for some tens of thousands of years before white men came to Brochet either fell on deaf ears or roused my listeners to fury at my partisanship. One day, early in the winter, a trader burst into my cabin in a state of great excitement. "Listen," he said challengingly, "you've been screaming for proof that wolves butcher the herds. Well, hitch up your team and get out to Fish Duck Lake. One of my trappers came in an hour ago, and he's seen 50 deer down on the ice, all of them killed by wolves, and hardly a mouthful of the meat been touched." Accompanied by a Cree Indian companion, I did as I was bid, and late that afternoon we reached Fish Duck Lake. We found a sickening scene of slaughter. Scattered on the ice were the carcasses of 23 caribou, and there was enough blood about to turn great patches of snow into crimson slush. The trapper had been correct in stating that no use had been made of the carcasses. Apart from some minor scavenging by foxes, jays, and ravens, all but 3 of the animals were untouched. 2 of those 3 were bucks, minus their heads, while the third, a young and pregnant doe, was minus both hindquarters. Unfortunately for the proof, none of these deer could have been attacked by wolves. There were no wolf tracks anywhere on the lake. But there were other tracks. The unmistakable triple trail left by the skis and tail skid of a plane, which had taxied all over the place, leaving the snow surface scarred with a crisscross mesh of serpentine lines. These deer had not been pulled down by wolves, they had been shot, some of them several times. One had run 100 yards with its intestines dragging on the ice as a result of a gut wound. Several of the others had 2 or more bullet-broken limbs. The explanation of what had actually happened was not too far to seek. 2 years earlier, the Tourist Bureau of the provincial government concerned had decided that barrenland caribou would make an irresistible bait with which to lure rich trophy hunters up from the USA. Accordingly, a scheme was devised for the provision of fully organized safaris, in which parties of sportsmen would be flown into the subarctic, sometimes in government-owned planes, and for $1,000 each would be guaranteed a first-rate set of caribou antlers. During the winter sojourn of the caribou inside the timberline, they feed in the woods at dawn and dusk and spend the daylight hours yarded on the ice of the open lakes. The pilot of the safari aircraft had only to choose a lake with a large band of caribou on it, and, by circling for a while at low altitude, bunch all the deer into one tight and milling mob. Then the aircraft landed, but kept underway, taxiing around and around the panic-stricken herd to prevent it from breaking up. Through open doors and windows of the aircraft, the hunters could maintain a steady fire until they had killed enough deer to ensure a good number of trophies, from which the finest would be selected. They presumably felt that, since the jaunt was costing a great deal of money, they were entitled to make quite certain of results. It is to be assumed that the government officials concerned agreed with them. When the shooting was over, the carcasses were examined and the best available head taken by each hunter, whose permit entitled him to the possession of only a single caribou. If the hunters were also fond of venison, a few quarters would be cut off and thrown aboard the plane, which would then depart southward. The Cree Indian who had accompanied me had observed this sequence of events for himself the previous winter while acting as a guide. He did not like it, but he knew enough of the status of the Indian in the white man's world to realize he might just as well keep his indignation to himself. I was more naive. The next day, I radioed a full report of the incident to the proper authorities. I received no reply, unless the fact that the provincial government raised the bounty on wolves some weeks afterwards could be considered a reply. The problem of how I was to make my way south to Brochet from Wolf House Bay was resolved one morning when Utek burst into the cabin to announce that he had seen an aircraft. Sure enough, a Norseman plane on floats was lazily circling over the tundra to the west of us. I had long since given up hope that the pilot who had brought me to Wolf House Bay would ever return, and so the sight of this plane sent me into a dither of excitement. Remembering the smoke generators with which I had been supplied, I ran to get them. To my surprise, they worked. A mighty coil of black and oily smoke went soaring into the high skies, and the Norseman, which had disappeared to the west, reappeared, homing on my signal column. It landed in the bay, and I went out by canoe to greet the pilot, a narrow-faced and unprepossessing-looking young man chewing a wad of gum. He had much to tell me. As the months had passed without any word from me, my department had grown increasingly disturbed. Not only had they received no wolf reports, but some $4,000 worth of government equipment had vanished into the tundra void. This was serious, since some inquisitive member of the opposition might at any time have got wind of the matter and asked a question in the House of Commons. The possibility of being accused of carelessness in the handling of public funds is a bogey which haunts every government department. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police were therefore asked to find me, but clues were scarce. The pilot who had taken me into the Barrens had since gone missing on a flight over the Mackenzie district, and the police couldn't find any trace of him, let alone discover what he had done with me. Eventually, and after a great deal of sleuthing, the police got hold of the rumor circulating in Churchill to the effect that I was a Secret Service agent who'd been sent to spy on the floating Russian bases at the Pole, and they so reported to Ottawa, adding that they did not like being made mock of, and the next time the department wanted something found, it had better be honest with them. The pilot who had landed to investigate my smoke signal had not been sent to look for me, but was engaged in a prospecting survey, and his discovery of me was purely fortuitous. However, he agreed to carry a message back to his base, informing the department where its equipment was, and suggesting that a plane be sent to pick it up immediately before the freeze-up came. With Mike's assistance, the pilot took advantage of the landing to top up his gas tanks from drums carried in the fuselage. Meanwhile, I departed to complete some unfinished business at the Wolf Den Esker. In order to round out my study of wolf family life, I needed to know what the den was like inside, how deep it was, the diameter of the passage, the presence, if any, of a nest at the end of the burrow, and such related information. For obvious reasons, I had not been able to make this investigation while the den was occupied, and since that time I had been too busy with other work to get around to it. Now, with time running out, I was in a hurry. I trotted across country toward the den, and I was within half a mile of it when there was a thunderous roar behind me. It was so loud and unexpected that I involuntarily flung myself down on the moss. The Norseman came over at about 50 feet. As it roared past, the plane waggled its wings gaily in salute, then lifted to skim the crest of the Wolf Esker, sending a blast of sand down the slope with its propeller wash. I picked myself up and quieted my thumping heart, thinking black thoughts about the humorist and the now rapidly vanishing aircraft. The den ridge was, as I had expected, and as the Norseman would have made quite certain in any case, wolfless. Reaching the entrance to the burrow, I shed my heavy trousers, tunic, and sweater, and taking a flashlight, whose batteries were very nearly dead, and measuring tape from my pack, I began the difficult task of wiggling down the entrance tunnel. The flashlight was so dim it cast only an orange glow, barely sufficient to enable me to read the marks on the measuring tape. I squirmed onward, descending at a 45-degree angle for about 8 feet. My mouth and eyes were soon full of sand, and I was beginning to suffer from claustrophobia, for the tunnel was just big enough to admit me. At the 8-foot mark, the tunnel took a sharp upward bend and swung to the left. I pointed the torch in the new direction and pressed the switch. 4 green lights in the murk ahead reflected back the dim torch beam. Now, in this case, green was not the signal to advance. I froze where I was while my startled brain tried to digest the information that at least 2 wolves were with me in the den. Despite my close familiarity with this wolf family, This was the kind of situation where irrational but deeply ingrained prejudices completely overmaster reason and experience. To be honest, I was so frightened that paralysis gripped me. I had no weapon of any sort, and in my awkward position I could barely have gotten one hand free with which to ward off an attack. It seemed inevitable that the wolves would attack me, for even a gopher will make a fierce defense when he is cornered in his den. The wolves did not even growl. Save for the two faintly glowing pairs of eyes, they might not have been there at all. The paralysis began to ease, and, though it was a cold day, sweat broke out all over my body. In a fit of blind bravado, I shoved the torch forward as far as my arm would reach. It gave just sufficient light for me to recognize Angeline and one of the pups. They were scrunched hard against the back wall of the den, and they were as motionless as death. The shock was wearing off by this time, and the instinct for self-preservation was regaining command. As quickly as I could, I began wiggling back up the slanting tunnel, tense with the expectation that at any instant the wolves would charge. But by the time I reached the entrance and had scrambled well clear of it, I had still not heard nor seen the slightest sign of movement from the wolves. I sat down on a stone and shakily lit a cigarette, becoming aware as I did so that I was no longer frightened. Instead, an irrational rage possessed me. If I had had my rifle, I believe I might have reacted in brute fury and tried to kill both wolves. The cigarette burned down, and a wind began to blow out of the somber northern skies. I began to shiver again, this time from cold instead of rage. My anger was passing, and I was limp in the aftermath. Mine had been the fury of resentment born of fear, resentment against the beasts which had engendered naked terror in me, and who, by so doing, had intolerably affronted my human ego. I was appalled at the realization of how easily I had forgotten, and how readily I had denied all that the summer sojourn with the wolves had taught me about them, and about myself. I thought of Angeline and her pup cowering at the bottom of the den where they had taken refuge from the thundering apparition of the aircraft, and I was shamed. Somewhere to the eastward, a wolf howled, lightly, questioningly. I knew the voice, for I had heard it many times before. It was George, sounding the wasteland for an echo from the missing members of his family. But for me it was a voice which spoke of the lost world which once was ours, before we chose the alien role. A world which I had glimpsed and almost entered, only to be excluded at the end by my own self. 25 years have passed since I wrote Never Cry Wolf. I wish with all my heart that I could say our treatment of the wolf has improved during that quarter century, but I cannot. In truth, the very existence of the wolf, not only in North America but worldwide, is now in deadly question. The war against the great wild dog of wilderness continues unabated. In the continental United States and the settled parts of Canada, the wolf is now virtually extinct. Perhaps 50 individuals survive in the inner mountains of Mexico. In Alaska and the northern parts of Canada, the last and perhaps the final refuge of the wolf, the survivors are being pursued and destroyed with ever-mounting intensity. During the last 5 years alone, more than 8,000 wolves have been poisoned, trapped, or gunned down from helicopters by employees of the Fish and Game Department of British Columbia. The destruction in Alaska has been on an even greater scale. Wherever big game exists, powerful hunting lobbies, sometimes disguised as conservation groups, are exerting enormous pressures on government to exterminate the wolf, so that there will be more moose, mountain sheep, elk, caribou, and other herbivores for wealthy sports to slaughter. What chance does the wolf have in competition with modern man, the most rapacious, deadly, and insatiable killer the world has ever seen? Not much, perhaps, but if there is any chance for the kin of George, Angeline, and Uncle Albert, it is in your hands. I beg of you to lend them your support, so that the most magnificent of wilderness voices will not be forever silenced. If you've enjoyed this production of Never Cry Wolf, you may want to read the book. It's available in paperback wherever books are sold. You've been listening to Never Cry Wolf by Farley Mowat, produced by Blaine and DeRosa Productions Incorporated, copyright 1988, Bantam Audio Publishing. All rights reserved.